Community Affairs References Committee, and I declare open this hearing of the Senate Community Affairs References Committee's inquiry into the purpose, intent and adequacy of the Disability Support Pension. And I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're all meeting. I'm on Wurundjeri country in Melbourne, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I've got with me today Senator Wendy Askew, who is the Deputy Chair of the committee, and Senator Anne Urquhart, and I understand Senator Holly Hughes, who's going to join us later on this afternoon. So these are public proceedings and a Hansard transcript is being made, and the hearing is also being broadcast via the internet. I remind all witnesses that in giving evidence to the committee, they are protected by parliamentary privilege. It's unlawful for anyone to threaten or disadvantage a witness on account of evidence given to a committee, and such action may be treated by the Senate as contempt. It's also a contempt to give false or misleading evidence to a committee. The committee prefers all evidence to be given in public, although the committee may determine or agree to a request to have evidence heard in private session. If a witness objects to answering a question, the witness should state the ground on which the objection is taken, and the committee will determine whether it will insist on an answer, having regard to the ground which is claimed. If the committee determines to insist on an answer, a witness may request that the answer be given in camera. Such a request may also be heard at any other time. The committee understands that all witnesses appearing today have been provided with information regarding parliamentary privilege and the protection of witnesses. Additional copies of this information can be obtained from the Secretariat. And finally, I ask everyone to check their mobile phones to ensure that they are either switched off or turned to silent. So, to begin with our first session, I'm welcoming via video conference Ricky Spencer, and hopefully Mr. Primmer will be able to join us. And I also welcome Dini Leonaracci, got that right, from the Housing for the Aged Action Group. So thank you for appearing before the committee today. So, to start us off, could I please ask you to state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. So, starting with Ricky.
Oh, thank you, Senator Janet Rice. Hope you can all hear me very well. My name is Ricky Spencer. My pronouns are they, them and her. I'm coming from Wurundjeri land. I'm coming on the basis of someone who has been on the disability support pension for 12 years now. Lived experience as a trans woman, someone with complex disabilities, who has also has been impacted for housing over the last 15 years. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Leonaracci.
Thank you, Senator. I'm Dini Leonaracci. I'm the advocacy lead at Housing for the Aged Action Group. And I'm joining you from the lands of Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I will also be participating in the next session where our executive officer and I will also give further evidence to today's proceedings.
Great, thanks, Ms. Leonaracci. So I now invite both of you to make a brief opening statement, and then I'll invite the committee members to ask you some questions.
Well, thank you, Senator Janet Rice, for this opportunity to speak on this very important issue that I'm privileged to put a voice out there for people like myself living on a disability pension. And I want to start by acknowledging the fact that I am very grateful and appreciative that the government does provide a support pension for people like myself who would love to work, but unfortunately because of our medical and complex needs, we're just unable to participate in the work employment. I just want to start by saying that we should know that the pension itself has been quite supportive in terms of providing basic, meeting some basic needs, but there is also the complex issue of not being able to meet everything in terms of the medical out costs that the pension doesn't cater for, and also the complexity of obtaining rent, paying for rent. I've had the I have been lucky for 7 or 8 years living in a rental accommodation, but when I was unable to walk physically up my stairs and I crawl down the stairs to get up and down from my flat, I was under scared I was going to become homeless. And I just wanted to share that with people, because sometimes when you are working, and I was many years ago working, I didn't understand, but to apply for a rental accommodation when you're on a disability support pension and over 50 and you have little savings, you really are at the mercy of agents. And working with HAG in my voluntary capacity, as well as some other service providers that I speak on behalf of Indigenous trans women and other older women, we all share a common story, and that is we don't have any super, or hardly any super, and many of the real estate agents have been asking us for proof of how we are to pay it. And in my case, I had to almost give a guarantee that if I could pay 6 months in advance, even though I had always paid my rent on time for 8 years, it was not deemed enough. And I'm coming from someone who has 2 masters, working on a PhD, and yet I was still deemed as borderline. And I had to basically beg to say I would not complain. I will take the house as is, and I would promise to look after the garden, and I'll sign whatever condition I would. And yeah, I just wanted to really iterate that desperateness of what many of us face, the fear of not having anywhere to live. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Ricky Spencer. Ms. Leonora Archie.
Thank you, Senator. I will be appearing with my executive officer in the next session, and we have prepared an opening statement. I'm here today in support of Ricky and Max, who should be joining us as well. So they will be giving evidence. I'm here to provide additional support if necessary for this session.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so look, let's start off with some questions to Ms. Spencer then. So, Ricky, so can you talk us through, so you're on the DSP.
That's correct.
Can you talk us through your experience of getting onto the DSP?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And then probably sort of expanding on what being on the DSP, how the things that you are and you aren't able to do as
Sure.
being on the DSP.
Thank you. It was about 12 years ago when, due to my failing health, I was unable to no longer work in my previously trained role as a social worker, and I didn't know what I was going to do, so I rang up Centrelink at that time, it was known, and applied, and my doctors at the time stated that I really have limited capacity to work. I had very failing complex mental health, coupled with post-traumatic stress disorder, anxiety, depression, and other underlying mental health diagnosed conditions. When I rang up to go onto the pension, I was also on a lot of medication. The process took hours, and in the end, even though I had the medical information, I was knocked back from the disability. At that stage, I was still mortgaged, and I just broke down. And I remember I attempted suicide because I thought there's no way out. How am I going to pay for my home? How am I going to feed my animals? How am I going to live? And I was so angry. And then I remember a friend, luckily enough, found me, and I was re-hospitalized. And then a worker again rang, and it took about 6 to 8 weeks to finally get onto the disability pension. And it was so complex and traumatizing, because the person kept saying to me on the phone, because it was all through the phone, and even in those days, don't you think you could try and work in a shop, or work, Coles pushing trolleys and to that? And I mean, I would, if I could, I would have, but I was just not in any capacity to work. So it really was traumatizing, and this was going back then. And when I got onto it, it was just having those hurdles to every couple of months to fill in forms, to get doctor certificates. And I just want to remind everyone that's listening, it's not just a matter of the process of going on to Centrelink requires you to attend medical appointments and obtain evidence. That evidence is in a form of, in those days, was paper copies to submit to Centrelink, which required you to photocopy the costs of that. I remember that in the clinic that I had when I lived out in the outer eastern suburbs at that time, before I lost my home, the doctors at that time were charging $175 for a disability assessment. That's how much. It's not covered by Medicare. So that's number one. So some of us have that added burden where we have to pay just for the privilege of getting a doctor's assessment. And there's no guarantee. And I understand that because it all depends on your assessment. So that's that whole process and ongoing, and the fact that you had to obtain all this information at your own expense. And if you're not able to drive yourself or catch transport, it makes it very difficult. Even up to now, I've always had that fear that I'm going to be, someone's going to come knocking on my door or give me a letter to say, we want you to go to work. And I would love to if I could work for 6 to 8 hours as a teacher. And I had tried, as some people may know that, but being someone who identifies as transgender, it is difficult. I can barely walk. I have a tumor, a pituitary tumor, as well as lower back injuries, as well as mental health. I am trying my best, and I do a lot of volunteer work, and I hope that helps pay back to the community. But it's just the added cost of medicine with creams. I have a lot of skin conditions that are not covered by the disability pension, like the PBS, nor NDIS. So I try and scrape. So as long as I have enough for my rent priority, my medication, then it comes my bills. And then if I'm lucky enough to have some money left over, normally about $20, I'll buy myself some food. I try not to access services in the community because I know there are more vulnerable people than myself, elderly, who I think should get more priority. But I just wanted to let everybody know listening that the misconception that the disability is a living wage, I'm so sorry to say it is not. We now have to have the NBIN, which means that if you want, like with the COVID, to contact doctors, you have to make sure your monthly payment is paid up for, and the minimum cost to run NBN is something like $60 a month. So you must make sure you pay that. And in my case, I wasn't allowed to pay it up front. To pay it, I had to sign so they will take it out of my bank directly because I was not working. Sorry if I'm speaking too much. I just don't know where
it's
to
been really
go.
valuable to hear your experience, Ms. Spencer, as somebody that's with that lived experience of what it's like to live on the DSP. Can you talk us through what your experience of actually dealing with Centrelink in terms of staying on the DSP is now?
Look, it's been complex. There are times, I remember I was about 5 years ago, I worked casually, and I was one of those people that had a robo debt. I can't remember what they called it. And I said to them, I had always declared my earnings. And I remember the girl was quite rude to me and said, well, obviously you don't know how to report your earnings. That was her words. And I felt really ashamed of myself that in my life, that I would never falsely declare. And I remember it was the words that was used, that you falsely declared. And I thought I would never, ever falsely declare anything in my life. And the shame of that, was quite, and I lived with it. And it wasn't until years ago when I knew I wouldn't do that, because I'd work a few casual hours. And that it's just that you're unbelief. And I remember there are many times when I've tried to ring up Centrelink because I had to know about, about the rental, like when I changed my rent, and to see to update my file because I couldn't access it online. And it took me 3 hours on the line. Now, just to remind people, when you're on a pension, everything costs money. Now, to be on the line for 3 hours to wait, and then you are, you can't do anything. I was scared to take the phone off because I thought if I don't properly put my rental information to them, I could have my pension stopped. So the obligation is on you to contact them. When I tried with my sticks to go into an office, I was directed to say, why did you come into the office? You should have done it over the telephone. See, so that whole notion of customer service doesn't exist with Centrelink. And there's people I know a lot worse than myself who are wheelchair bound, who maybe have an intellectual disability, who have social anxiety. It's complicated. It's not always easy for us to articulate on the telephone. Some of my colleagues cannot speak well because they have cerebral palsy, but we want to be as independent, and then we get told that we can't understand you, and then where do we go? And to try and navigate into an office, and then you've got to wait and wait and wait. So then someone sends to you, and then again, it's like you've always got to provide the information. It's not like even with forms, they won't even. Used to be in the old days, you'd get a pack to fill in. Now I remember when I rang up for my rental, they said, no, we don't send things out. You have to print it out. And I tried to explain to the customer service officer on the phone, I remember, with an update, I said, look, I appreciate that, but however, it does cost me money. I would have to go and pay for my printer, which I didn't have at that stage. I would have to go to a public library. And these days, 50 cents to $1, to get things, every little bit costs. And I think sometimes Centrelink has taken advantage of being paperless, and used as environmental. And I understand that, but there should be some compassion for us older people with disabilities, that to bring back a bit more customer care into welfare.
To feel that they're making life very difficult for you rather than sort of making it easy for you to access
Yes.
the income support. Can you talk us through a bit more about what it means in terms of the level of the pension, and it's not covering your needs, and
Absolutely.
particularly, from an intersectional perspective of you as an Indigenous trans person, and how that makes the circumstances even more difficult than so many other people.
Okay. For me, I also, and I know people might say, well, it's your choice to go on HRT, hormone replacement therapy, to affirm my gender. For about 2 months, because of COVID, they had run out of one of the subsidized estrogen tablets that I was on. And normally I'm paying $6.50 for one packet every fortnight. But at one stage I was having to pay $60. I think it was $60 a fortnight with no subsidy, and I had to do that for 2 months. And I'm a bit embarrassed to say I didn't eat for the 2 weeks. I kind of lived off lucky I had some cans of spaghetti, so I ate with that. And that's something some of us, I guess I want to say, we live in shame, because I've rung up services once during COVID, and I was so embarrassed because I was asked so many intrusive questions, like being misgendered, and then people said they would come to my house to do an assessment. Well, I was embarrassed to have people I don't know coming to my house to look through my cupboards to verify whether I had enough food. And I was just not comfortable, with that. In terms of costs, electricity, I have arthritis, so I try and keep and stay warm with blankets. But sometimes I have so much pain, I have to have the gas heater on. And, those costs are quite, like my bills last time for electricity, I think it was 450 plus another 320 for gas for my 3-month period. And then I had to make sure, I think I was 3 days late, and then the provider rang me and said, you know, I think, no, they sent me a thing to say that, you know, if you do not contact us within 12 days, you may be disconnected. So that fear of always trying to scrape to get money. And I remember just thinking to myself, I'm frightened because I've mentioned before previously that I do have teeth issues, like they do hurt, but I'm so scared. I've been on the wait list for 2.5 years, haven't been rung back, and like I have tried to ring and they say you just have to wait and then they hang up on you. And it's like, I just fear that if anything goes wrong with my health, I don't know what I'm going to do, because some of the services I do with MRIs and blood, some of the other tests I do, they require you to have like a part payment that you can claim. Oh, the other thing quickly to mention, sorry everyone, I get a bit muddled up. I see a psychologist every month and a psychiatrist every 2 months. In both cases, I have to pay up front for both of them, and I get, I think it's $60 back from my psychologist, but for the psychiatrist, I'm out of pocket $155. So, you know, I just always pray to God, I just have enough to just have zero. I only have left in my super only a couple $1,000. Look, I'm grateful that I've got $3,000 or $4,000 left. Touch wood. If I'm forced to move from this old house, I want to make sure I have something to move to. But it's very hard, everyone. It's really hard, because I always pray to God I have enough that nothing goes wrong for hospital, because I don't have anything, you know, and if they had to come and take stuff away so I can pay for any surgery, I will do it. But, you know, we try our best. We don't want to be a burden to people, to taxpayers, but it's so hard. It really is hard.
And it's hard on your health and for feeling well if you're
Yeah.
living at that level.
Can I, sorry, Senator Jarrett, just one quickly too, with my volunteer with Indigenous women. A lot of the women I've spoken to do have difficulty obtaining accommodation and are living in unsecured housing. So a lot of them find it difficult to, because of paperwork. We don't have affirmed appropriate paperwork that I was told to at my agents. So I had to present as male because they wouldn't recognize. They said, well, you can't have one or the other. That's what I was told. You got to have, and I can't afford to have papers work change. A lot of my Indigenous trans friends struggle and live in temporary shared housing and are transient, because if you can't get work or you're on a pension and you're trying to pay for all your treatments, your blood tests and everything, it's difficult. And it's difficult to get into the rental market now because we're competing against the working poor, people who are working casually. And it has been relayed to me that, you know, if they have to make a choice, and I understand homeowners are the ones, they are going to choose someone who's working casually over someone on a pension, because they see us as more of a risk of not paying.
So hard. Look, I'll go to Senator Urquhart, who I understand's got a question.
Yeah, thanks very much. And Ricky, thank you for your evidence. I mean, a lot of things are going around in my head about some of the points you raised, but I think what I'd like to ask you is, what sort of things, what improvements do you think could be made to around some of those issues that you've raised that could actually make living on the disability pension easier for someone like yourself?
It would be lovely to have, I guess, some sort of support or something around how accessing housing, affordable, secured housing with the disability pension. As though if the government could, I guess they cannot guarantee a person's, but if they could sort of say, this person, you know, meets some criteria or something, that we would have some sorts of support, because at the moment we're on the mercy of these agents, and some of us have little. And I guess I know it's hard to raise money because there's not much money, but you know, it's just hard with the even raising the rent subsidy, you know, $30 or $40 a fortnight would be a help. It would be the difference between not eating and having something to eat. And I'm not saying that we're buying steaks or anything like that. I'm just talking about having enough to buy milk, fresh milk, not powdered milk, and bread that's not gone moldy. You know, and many of us talk about how we scrape off the mold and use, you know, powdered milk just to get us through. And that's what I'm asking, senators, is please consider $30. It's all I'm asking.
So
Sorry, I didn't mean to speak like this, but
No, it's
I'm
fine.
speaking from the heart.
Absolutely. You're doing really well, and it's very brave
I'm
of you.
sorry.
But we need to, I'm sorry to ask you these.
No,
difficult
that's okay. I'm
questions,
sorry.
but
It's just honesty. It's
Yeah,
coming from the
absolutely.
heart.
Yeah.
And
for
I never
us to
thought in my life I would be like
Yeah.
this. I always thought I'd work.
Yeah.
And now I feel I'm old. Nobody wants me to work, and I have. And I'm just at the mercy of
Yeah.
the government.
But you have a lot to give, obviously, because you volunteer and you help other people. So
I do, because there's a lot worse than me. And I
yeah,
know that, but I just want everyone to know that please don't forget about us.
yeah, and that's the importance of us and people like yourself appearing on Senate inquiries, is because we need to understand the sorts of things that you are dealing with every day. So you talked about having, I think, $20 or $30 maybe left over for food.
Yes.
That's for a fortnight, is it?
Yes, that's correct. Yes, on a good week, on a really good fortnight. Sorry.
So how do you deal with that? How do you manage to you know, feed yourself for
Oh,
that?
I look at a lot of markets have markdowns, so you
Yeah.
just go to the markdown section
Yeah.
when you can. Because the other thing, just to let everybody know, I'm lucky now that I can use my sticks to walk to places
Okay.
and get that. But when I was immobile, when my everything ceased up, that's when I really struggled, because when COVID and you could only get food online, that was a nightmare, because you would have noticed that many places like Woolies and that don't deliver,
That's
you know,
right.
for and you had, if you wanted as under amount, you had to pay $80. Well, who can afford to pay $80 ahead of time? You know, so you either go without, or you have to have a network of friends that say that someone can buy any
Yeah.
processed food or really marked down. So you go to the vegetable places that have maybe the thing is half good, half not so good. You cut out the bits that aren't that are damaged, and you just eat that. So you try and make do with very, you know, with a lot. And I'm now trying to grow. Now that I'm blessed that I'm in a house, just to grow my own vegetables, and that, and I have a lemon tree, thank God. So I
Lovely.
use a lot of, you know, baking and things just to, you know, and I share that with the community, because there are a lot of people worse off than me that don't have anywhere to live. So
Yeah.
it's about, I guess, maybe also a cultural shift. If we could somehow get people to care more, and maybe we can encourage green diversity in people growing more vegetables and sharing that. Maybe that's another option. I don't know.
Do you think that's do you think any of that's happened during COVID in any way? Have you
Oh,
seen it?
yes, in Facebook, I've noticed that
Yeah.
there's been, especially around my area, around the Footscray area, people have been more willing to share. And, you know, we have boxes outside our streets where people could come and take lemons, or
Lovely.
people have beans to share. So there
Yeah.
is a more of a community spirit, and I
Yeah.
appreciate that. And that could be something fostered, you know,
Yeah.
in the growth. But I'm also thinking that in terms of rental, because they are going up, and yeah, now I'm sorry, I'm getting myself back together. So sorry about that before.
No, that's all right.
You know, the problem with rent is it's going up. It's going
Yeah.
at a higher rate and the rental assistance is being capped.
Yes.
So the problem with $135, I think, is the major capping.
Yes.
But many of us are paying like $350 is the
Yeah.
minimum now of rent a week. So, and the other thing is that, just to let you know, many of us cannot climb upstairs, cannot walk upstairs. So we have to look for ground floor places.
So you're very limited in the
Limited,
opportunity.
very much so, and we have to be near our doctors and hospitals, because if we live, like, I would love to live in Bendigo or somewhere, but even those houses are now unaffordable. And I remember when I rang up 5 agents in Bendigo, they said that they had waiting lists, and the girl was lovely to me on the phone. She said, because I was telling her my story, and she said, unfortunately, they will prioritise working people over people on Centrelink payments now.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. It's a struggle. I mean, I live in northwestern Tasmania here, and it's a difficulty here to get any sort of housing, rental accommodation at a reasonable price as well. So I understand the sort of things you're talking about. When you said you were, you're at the mercy of the agents.
Yeah.
Is that because you're in private rental, and that's who you're talking about?
Yes.
Right.
Because I wasn't able to, like, I have a few things that I have, and the other thing is, and maybe it's a bad thing, I don't know, I'm lonely, so I have my 2 cats that I love dearly, and I know I don't want to put them down or get rid of them. That's my life, and for many of us, that's all we have.
Yeah.
So
I have 2 cats too, so I understand. Can I just ask you one final question?
Senator Urquhart, we've been told that Mr. Primer is actually on the phone, so we've
fantastic. Well, I'll just ask Ricky one final question, and that is around, you mentioned about the medication, and how you had to pay extra because what you would normally on was not available.
Yeah, the HRT. Yeah.
So did you not get that through? Were you not able to get that at the PBS price? Is that
no? Not some. It was no chemist would do that particular one for that price, because it was that, like, because of COVID. I don't know. Maybe it's changed. At that time, that a lot of people from the trans community, messages were going around because there was stopping in making it or something, and some people had gone without, and I just was, I just thought, well, I decided I needed my treatment, and if I had stopped, it would have played havoc to my other conditions with the pituitary tumor I've got. So I had to prioritize that, and $60. What I had, I'm at the mercy, and I look, I'm not complaining. I'm happy I could do that, and I did it. But it's just when someone brought it home to me when I explained how do I live on 20, I'm embarrassed to say it, because I never thought in my whole life I would be like that, where I would be looking at food that's gone off just so that I could eat.
Yeah. You should never be embarrassed about it, Ricky. It's something that I think needs to be addressed, but don't ever feel embarrassed about it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you so much, Ricky, for presenting.
Oh, thank you for giving me the opportunity, for caring.
Really important evidence. So I understand we've got Max Primer on the phone. Mr. Primer?
Yes, I'm here. Yes.
Fantastic. Good. I'd like to just share your story with us, and then we'll have a little bit of time, just a couple of minutes to ask you questions.
Okay. So my name's Max Primer. I live on the Jojo Wurrung country, and I've been on the disability support pension since 2008, and that came about through my issue with total kidney failure. And at that particular time, I was working, and all of a sudden I couldn't work. I spent a lot of time in hospital at the start of this journey. And the social worker at the hospital got me, when I came out of hospital, got me to go to Centrelink. And when I went in there, I had no money in the bank. I'd spent everything. I was trying to buy a house at that stage when it happened, so I had a mortgage to pay as well. And I was very, very fortunate, and I do appreciate the fact that I got on the disability support pension, and it came through fairly quickly for me, which was excellent. that was great to have that as a backup, and to get money every fortnight was excellent. But at that particular stage, I had to see a lot of surgeons and get anaesthetists and all sorts of people on board, and that was not covered in any way by the pension. So, I had to come up with $600 here and $900 there. A couple of the operations I had done, I had to get reversed, and that was like $600 up front. So it was very, very tough. And over the years since I've been in it, I've learned how to manage it much better. A lot of support from family and friends, which has been absolutely amazing. And now I'm in a private rental house, and the lady who I'm renting this house from, I might get a bit teary here, but she's actually included me in her will so that if anything happens to her, I'm not allowed to be kicked out of this house, and the rent is not allowed to change for as long as I live. So, that makes it very, 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 very fortunate for me to be in this position rather than trying to find a rental property. But I'm also lucky as I can still drive. And once again, that's another expense with registration, insurance, fuel. So I try to drive as little as possible. And, thank goodness for op shops and places like that where you can buy cheaper clothing, and you can go to, like Ricky said, you can go to certain places where they do vegetables that might be a few days old, and many people don't want them because they're a bit limp or they're a bit discoloured. So we have got that to fall back on. And like I said before, family and friends have been really, really good, and I do get support that way. But it is still very difficult on a disability support pension to make ends meet with electricity and the rest of the stuff you've got to do.
That sounds like it's. Thank you, Mr. Primmer. It sounds like at least having the security of knowing that your rent's not going to go up and that you've got secure housing as long as you can keep on affording to pay that is of great value. Could you talk us through? I mean, so you said you're in Djadja Wurrung country, so you're in a regional area. How what's it in terms of having to drive to get to places? Can you talk us through some of the extra issues associated with being in a regional area rather than having access to the things in the city?
Yeah, well, I think, I'm very fortunate in living in an area of Daylesford, which is halfway between Bendigo and Ballarat. We have an amazing medical centre here with 12 doctors who are readily available. I have a doctor who's looked after me now for the last 8 years, and I'm very fortunate that I can call him at any stage if I need to see him. He books all my appointments a month ahead. When it came time for COVID vaccines, he had all those already booked in for me, so all I had to do was attend them. And he's very mindful of the fact that I'm on a disability support pension, so he makes sure that if I've got an appointment at the doctor's, it's on a day when I've got other things to do, so I don't make trips backwards and forwards, like to do different chores I've got to do. But it's still, it's still something that you've got to be very aware of. And as for hospitals, once again, we have a great medical team here, and I was at Ballarat Base when my kidney failure was announced, or when I found out about it. And of course, that was all done through Medibank or Medicare. So I was very lucky with that as well, that all that support was there to help me through. Because I obviously can't afford private health insurance. So having all that available and living in the place I live, I'm really, really very happy.
Okay. So what changes would you like to see with the way that the DSP operates?
Well, I think what Ricky said, I totally agree with. Like, even though I've got permanent accommodation, it is $580 a fortnight I pay. So, you take that out of your fortnightly pension as well as your electricity and the rest of the bills you've got to pay. It is quite a lot of money. So I think, even if it was $30, $40, $50 a week extra, would make a big difference, because it would mean that, you know, you could probably buy better food, or you could do another little job that that you can't do now because you've got to watch every penny. And thank goodness for the DSP, because of medications. Of course, I now have had a transplant, so I've got a new kidney, which is coming up for 10 years old. But I've also had open heart surgery, so I'm on medication for that as well. And by the time you add all the medications up, thankfully they're only $6.50 each. And you know, when you get these tablets from the chemist, you look at the real price, which they usually print on the box, and you just wouldn't be able to afford them. So I'm really grateful that we've got these things to help us through.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm glad you were able to join us to share your story with us today.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you, Senators.
Yep. So, Senator Urquhart and Askew, you're fine with moving on, given that we're at 2:15. So, look, thanks so much, Mr. Premier, Ms. Spencer. It's been really great to hear your evidence before us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you so much for listening to our voices.
Thank you. So I now welcome via video conference representatives from the Housing for the Aged Action Group, who's been with us, and the Public Interest Advocacy Centre. So thank you for appearing before the committee today. I'm Senator Janet Rice, the chair of the committee, and we've got Senators Anne Urquhart and the Deputy Chair, Senator Wendy Askew, also joining us today. So to start off with, can I please ask you each to state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. We've already heard from Ms. Leona Anarachi, so we'll go to the so Ms. York also from the Housing for the Aged Action Group.
My name's Fiona York. I'm the Executive Officer of Housing for the Aged Action Group.
Thanks, Ms. York. And from the Public Interest Advocacy Centre.
Hi, my name is Thomas Chailloux. I'm the Policy Officer for the Homeless Persons Legal Service, which is part of the Public Interest Advocacy Centre. Thank you.
Right. And so, okay, now Ms. Harrison, you're here for the session afterwards. So great. Okay, so and can I ask you to speak clearly and identify yourself each time you speak to assist with the recording and the broadcast of these proceedings. So I now invite you each to make a brief opening statement, should you wish to do so, and then the committee will ask you some questions. So starting with the Housing for the Aged Action Group.
Thank you, Senators. As I mentioned, my name is Fiona York. I'm the Executive Officer of Housing for the Aged Action Group. Before I begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting. I'm joining you from the Wurundjeri lands of the Kulin Nation down in Melbourne, and my colleague Dinny is joining us from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney. We pay our respects to elders past and present and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded. Thank you so much for the opportunity to give evidence today and for facilitating the previous hearing with two members of our LGBTI reference group. Housing for the Aged Action Group was established 35 years ago as a grassroots member organisation, and we deliver the Home at Last service, which is a housing information and support service for older people in Victoria. We also advocate for older people experiencing housing and homelessness across the country. Our service provides early intervention by delivering community and peer education, and we try to encourage older people to plan for their housing future before they reach a crisis point. We also provide one-on-one support for people to access safe and affordable housing. We coordinate a number of advisory groups, including our LGBTI reference group, who you heard from today, our cultural diversity reference group, our peer educators, our retirement housing action group, and a National Alliance of Seniors for Housing. So all of our information is informed by this lived experience of people in different types of housing and housing experience. Of the 158 people that we supported last year, around 50% of those needed assistance due to long-term health conditions or disabilities which affected their mobility. And there is very little accessible housing across the country, let alone accessible, affordable housing. According to Anglicare Australia's rental affordability snapshot earlier this year, only 0.3% or 236 properties were affordable for people on the disability support pension across the country. We support a number of people who have a disability who are not on DSP but are on job seeker payment, and we believe that they should be eligible for disability support pension. Our biggest concern for people living with a disability on job seeker and DSP is their housing costs. After housing costs, the majority of people who we support who are on the DSP are in severe housing stress, unable to afford food, electricity, water, medication, and other essentials. We know from working with our clients that they are fearful of unexpected expenses such as dental, medical, or even replacing broken appliances because they simply can't afford to do so. They may go without food or other essentials just to pay their rent or pay a medical bill. Some people that we support have moved to regional areas to find cheaper housing. However, there's a lack of appropriate services in regional areas, which means they spend time and money to travel to the city to access these services, or they forego them simply because they don't have enough money. And our recent data shows that rental availability is almost non-existent in many regional areas due to COVID. We are a supporter of the Building Better Homes campaign, which was recently successful in getting mandatory minimum accessibility standards into the National Construction Code so that all new buildings must be accessible for people with a disability and for older people, which is great news. However, some states such as New South Wales, WA and the ACT are not planning to implement these building code requirements. This means that there will be additional pressure for people living in these places who have a disability or a mobility issue to be able to find accessible and affordable long-term housing in the future. We're also a signatory to the recommendations made by People with a Disability Australia to this committee, and we joined the sector in strongly recommending that DSP payments, including the Commonwealth Rent Assistance, are increased to a livable standard, and to increase the scope of DSP eligibility so that people with a disability are not forced into job seeker payments that have more stringent mutual obligations. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any other questions that you may have relating to the experience of housing and homelessness for people in DSP.
Sorry, I was on mute. Thanks, Ms. York. So, Mr. Shalou, did you wish to make an opening statement?
I do. Thank you, Senator. Thank you for the opportunity to appear at this Senate hearing. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land I'm on today in Katoomba, the Darug and Gundungurra people, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. The Public Interest Advocacy Centre is a social justice law and policy centre. We are an independent, non-for-profit organisation working with people facing disadvantage. Our submission and comments today are based on the experiences of PIAC Homeless Persons Legal Service, its clients, and other people with lived experience of homelessness, including members of PIAC Advisory Committee Street Care. The disability support pension ought to be an income support payment that enables people with disability with no limited overall capacity to work to live with dignity and support their full and effective participation in society. Living with dignity includes access to adequate housing, food, utilities, healthcare, transport, education, and other essential needs. The DSP currently fails to meet these objectives, in our view. First, inadequate levels of payment place people in receipt of the DSP at risk of homelessness and force them to live in poverty. Second, people face significant barriers to accessing the DSP, such as complex and strict eligibility criteria, a rigid assessment process that fails to consider the cumulative impact of multiple conditions, but also the fluctuating nature of some conditions. And finally, barriers to obtaining medical evidence. As a result of these barriers, some people with disability experiencing or at risk of homelessness are forced to survive on the job seeker payment, which is even lower than the DSP. In our experience, often because of their disability itself or their homelessness, these people struggle to comply with mutual obligation requirements. This leads to payment suspensions and further hardship. Some people who have had their application for the DSP repeatedly refused will stop trying to access their entitlements altogether because they feel that they cannot gather evidence or pursue appeals. People who do not receive any income experience longer, more serious episodes of homelessness, impacting their physical and mental health. This increases costs for the specialist homelessness services system, of course, but also the health, law enforcement, and criminal justice system. Instead of creating further hardship and exclusion, the DSP should support full and effective participation in society. This means enabling homeless people with disability to find a secure, stable home from where they can engage with support services, education, employment, and their community. People experiencing homelessness often have difficult lives with competing priorities. They need to fill their basic needs, such as finding a safe place to sleep at night. This is overwhelming and time-consuming, but they are also often dealing with trauma, mental illness, and severe medical conditions at the same time. We need to do more to support people accessing the DSP and other social security payments. This can be done by exempting people experiencing homelessness from mutual obligations requirements, providing support to assist them with their social security claims, and supporting DSP applicants experiencing homelessness to obtain medical evidence. This should be done by making funding available for support services or directly to medical professionals, and reintroducing the treating doctor report. The DSP has become increasingly rigid. Some people clear the bar, they are deemed deserving of the payment, and others are left lingering on the program of support. HPLS recommends that this program is abolished. The DSP should also enable people with disability with some capacity to work to do so by being a flexible payment that minimizes work disincentives. People with disability are best able to engage with their community and the labor market when their basic needs, including housing, are met. Payment levels must urgently be raised. The DSP must be reformed so people with disability can live with dignity and free of poverty, regardless of their circumstances. Thank you. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much. Look, I just want to start by asking both of you, it seems from the people that you work with that the risk of homelessness, given the high cost of housing, must be ever present. And just what the impact of that is, both on the individual and on society, to be having such a big cohort of people at such risk of homelessness.
I'm happy to take that to start. So what we see is because the payment is so low, once people have paid their rent, they have very little money left to afford essentials. So they are essentially always one issue away from being at risk of being evicted, in particular if they're unable to access social housing and if they're in the private rental market. So if they had a bit of an increase in cost with medication or a new issue, they can fall in rental arrears and then they can very easily be evicted. And once they are evicted, it can be very difficult to get back into the private rental market because of issues around discrimination and increased costs. When you have a disability, you often need specific housing, such as housing on the ground level, as we've heard before. So I think it's important to realize that with such a low level of payment, living in poverty after housing costs, you're always just one issue away from becoming homeless.
I would just add to that to say that from our experience, anybody that's living in private rental is potentially at risk of homelessness if they're on the DSP or other sort of government support payment because of the high cost of rental and also the lack of security of tenure in the various state rental laws. So it means that people can be evicted at any time, and because they're forced into the lower cost end of the rental market, often that housing is inappropriate and inaccessible. So there needs to be a range of measures put in place both at federal and state level to improve security of tenure and housing accessibility. But the lack of affordable housing is the fundamental barrier across the country to people having a healthy and fulfilling life. Housing is the number one issue that underpins health and well-being for people above all else. Without the security of affordable housing and a place where you can stay as long as you need to stay, you cannot possibly participate in society to the best of your abilities. And so it's a massive cost to society.
And what's the trajectory? So if they've been evicted, difficulty, can't pay the rent, can't get back into the private rental market, I mean, where do your clients end up living?
So in Victoria, we have a priority housing system for people who are 55 years and older, and we're a service that only works with older people. So we can get people into community and public housing. But as was mentioned by one of your earlier people on the panel, the rent is capped at 25 to 30% of your income. And because the DSP and the job seeker payments are so low, 25% to 30% of that is not an attractive prospect to a community housing provider that also has debts that they need to consider. So the working poor or casual workers are more attractive tenants to people on the very lowest forms of income payment. And as we're seeing across the country, there's less investment in public housing and more investment in community housing, which means there's less options for the most vulnerable people.
Can I quickly add something to Fiona's answer? So in New South Wales, we don't have a service similar to the one we have in Victoria to support people over 55 to navigate the housing system, and it's very complex. Just to give you one example, in New South Wales, you have to be 80 to be on the priority housing list, unless you have some form of difficult disability, but something like arthritis wouldn't necessarily qualify you for it. So often people with disability may be living in precarious housing, couch surfing, or living in their cars even, because they don't have any other options. So lack of affordability is one issue, but people also without having options living in precarious housing is another one.
So
Go on.
similarly to the action group, we would try to assist our clients in New South Wales to get into the priority list for social housing. Unfortunately, because of the dire lack of stock, it's often quite difficult to access a property. So a lot of our clients will start experiencing homelessness in boarding houses. This can be a particularly detrimental environment for people who have mental health issues or psychosocial disability or alcohol and drug issues, because in boarding houses, they are often in contact with people who are still using substances, and obviously it's not a place that is conducive to recovery. Unfortunately, a lot of our clients will end up either living in their car or rough sleeping. And as I've mentioned in my opening statement, this can be the beginning of a longer and deeper cycle of homelessness, which could have been prevented if we had early intervention that prevented that homelessness in the first place.
And would you like to comment on what impact it then has on people's overall health? You know, people who are on the DSP or have got significant disabilities are already struggling with a lot of health issues. So, yeah, just any sort of evidence about what that means to people's health and their ability to then contribute and participate in society.
Absolutely. So we'll often see people having to choose between paying rent or paying for food or paying for medication. So it sometimes prevents people from getting adequate healthcare and medication. They also have trouble accessing specialists or psychologists, psychiatrists, these type of services. It obviously has an impact on their physical and mental health, and that doesn't support their full and effective participation in society, because if their health is not at its best, then it becomes even harder to engage with their community, let alone the labour market and education.
And I would just add to that, we have a really interesting perspective on this, because we see people while they're in precarious housing, and then also after we've successfully housed them somewhere securely, and we can see the difference in people's health and well-being, you know, once they've got secure housing. So people are suddenly more able to participate as volunteers. They're able to get back into the workforce if they choose to. They're able to manage what little finances they do have once they have safe and affordable and accessible housing. And while they're in a precarious situation, the level of exhaustion and the inability to focus on anything due to the overwhelming stress of having to meet day-to-day basic needs to survive means that you're unable to participate fully. And then we see the difference. They're like different people once they've been housed securely. They're able to participate much more fully. And that's one of the joys of working in our services, that we can actually see the impact of having something, having a change in a person's life in that way.
Just to add to that, an interesting example is for people who are on community treatment orders, because they have a very severe psychosocial disability or mental health condition. Sometimes when they become homeless and start rough sleeping, their priorities will change. So they'll start focusing on getting food and finding shelter rather than complying with the conditions of the community treatment order. So for example, they won't go and get their depot injection, which is a monthly injection you would get when you have severe conditions such as paranoid schizophrenia. And what can happen is that they will eventually be in crisis and then have to be sectioned and go to hospital, which obviously is a tragedy for them as a person and really impedes their recovery, but also has additional costs for the health system, the law enforcement system, when really if they were securely housed and had adequate income, this would not have happened.
Mm. Can I ask you to reflect on the Services Australia and the Department of Social Security? They've recently done an evaluation of the changes to accessibility to the DSP that were introduced a few years ago that resulted in far fewer people being able to access the DSP. And they did a cost-benefit analysis that explicitly only looked at the benefits and costs from changing their processes, which cost them so much, and then that resulted in fewer people accessing the payment. And so they therefore concluded that that was a positive benefit, you know, tick the box in terms of the benefit cost ratio. Could I ask you to reflect on, you know, on that sort of evaluation of our, you know, disability support pension service, and what sort of assessment should we be undertaking to, you know, look at the overall benefits of providing people with an adequate enough income so that they can be, you know, living a reasonable life?
I'm happy to give that a go. It's a pretty big question. I think my first answer to this would be from a human rights perspective. I don't think it's adequate to do a cost-benefit analysis to shift people off the DSP and into an inadequate payment that forces them to live in poverty. I mean, this is completely at odds with the United Nations Conventions on the rights of persons with disability, the right to housing, the right to social security, and the integration of people with disability in society. The second point I'd like to make is that I highly doubt that a wider cost-benefit analysis would yield similar results if you take into consideration the costs to the, and I guess there is an element of cost shifting there from the federal level to the state level, but if you take into considerations the costs to the prison system, the costs to the health system, the impact on human capital, I mean, there's avoided costs that could be done by giving adequate income and housing to people with disability. And there is also all of these benefits that are not realized from full and effective participation.
Thank you. Mr. Xu, you mentioned, I'd like to move on to people who aren't on the DSP, who are on JobSeeker, which as we know is even less to survive on, and yet people who have got significant disabilities, and just asked for your reflections on, yeah, the program of support in particular, and the assess and how that process is working for people in terms of, you know, not being accepted onto the DSP.
From our perspective, the program of support is basically creating unnecessary delays in people accessing the DSP. It's particularly a problem for people experiencing homelessness because they have issues complying with the program of support. So it can create significant delays in them accessing this payment, which sometimes they are clearly eligible for. I think the other issue with people who are not on the DSP is that they often find themselves in catch-22 situations because of their disability or their homelessness. They have issues complying with the mutual obligations, and to get exemptions from the mutual obligations, they need to prove that they have a temporary lack of capacity to work. But to get into the DSP, they need to prove that the impairment is permanent. So they sort of find themselves in this situation where they have to prove different things to the two compliance systems of the two different payments. And this can then sometimes be used against them should they try to apply to DSP in the future. So, yeah.
Could you explain that a bit more? So why do they need to prove that their ailment is only temporary if they're on the DSP?
So sorry,
if they're on job seeker.
if they're on job seeker, if you're looking to get an exemption from mutual obligations requirements, you have to prove that you have a temporary incapacity to work. But to get onto the DSP, you have to prove that your impairments are permanent. So that's the catch-22 situations where people will submit medical evidence showing they are temporarily unable to work because they can't comply with the mutual obligations requirements for job seeker, often because of their disability. But this goes against any future claims for the DSP where they have to show that their condition is permanently limiting their capacity to work. I think one way to solve this issue would be for Services Australia to proactively contact people who have been getting exemptions from the mutual obligations requirements a number of times for a certain period and telling them, you know, if this is permanent, you should be applying for the DSP. You should not be getting repeated mutual obligations exemptions.
Can I just quickly add something to that answer? There's this expectation that people with disability will have been to the same GP and have the medical history in one place. If people have been experiencing homelessness or other challenges, they may not be able to gather that evidence very easily without the assistance of an advocate if they're lucky to have one. So there's this expectation in the system that people do keep their records and have been going to the same practitioner and have accumulated all the evidence the government requires to prove that they have all the evidence in one place, which is not the case for some people.
Yes, so it can be a huge barrier, as we've heard from other submitters. Ms. York, in your opening statement, I think you've quoted some statistics about only 0.3% of houses being affordable, but it was the 50%, was it 50% of the people that you're working with who, can you talk us through what that 50% of those people are?
So of the people that we housed in long-term affordable housing, half of them had mobility issues that impacted on their housing. So around a third of our clients come to us because the house that they're in is either unaffordable or inappropriate for some reason. And a lot of times that's, for example, living upstairs, living in a rundown rental with a step above the bath, things like that. And so when people have mobility issues caused by disability and also caused just by the aging process, they will find their housing, they won't be able to live in their housing anymore. And so we were quite startled when we looked at our data this year and found that half of our clients actually had mobility issues impacting on their housing. And so this speaks to both the affordability of the housing market, but also the lack of accessible housing options, and it prevents people from aging in place.
And what proportion of your clients, and I mean, so that's 50% with mobility issues, presumably you've then got an even greater percent who have got other disabilities and other health issues.
Yes.
Yes.
And a lot of time they're long-term chronic illnesses that may not be recognised under the disability support pension as well. So most of our clients, as we're an older person service, most of our clients are on around 45% are on the age pension. And there's about, I think it's about 25% are on DSP and the rest are on New Start or Job Seeker. So that gives you an indication of the kind of breakdown of the support payments for people that come to us. But of those people that are on Job Seeker, a number of them should be eligible for DSP due to chronic health or long-term health conditions, but don't meet the eligibility requirements. And in particular, our cultural diversity reference group is concerned around the 10-year wait that older migrants need to have before they're eligible for social security support. And when older migrants come to live with their adult children as adults, they often have a 10-year assurance of support, which means that they're unable to access payments under their own right.
Which is, yes, making life even more precarious.
And subject to elder abuse as well in some circumstances.
And presumably often the families that they have moved with their children may not have adequate income themselves. So yes, you've got households that are really just on the edge. Yeah. Look, thank thank you very much for your evidence today. It's been really valuable and useful to the committee. I don't think you took any questions on notice, but if you did want to provide any further information to the committee, if we could get it by the 7th of September, that would be great. So look, thank you, and thanks very much. It's been a really valuable session.
Thank you, Senator.
Thank you so much
Thank
for the
you,
opportunity, Senator.
So look, I now welcome via video conference representatives from the Darwin Community Legal Service, Legal Aid New South Wales, and the Queensland Advocacy Inc. So thank you for appearing before the committee today. I'm Senator Janet Rice. I'm the chair of the committee. I've got Senator Wendy Askew, who's the deputy chair, and Senator Anne Urquhart joining us today. And I think Senator Holly Hughes is going to join us in the next little while as well. So in order to start, let's begin by, if you could each state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. And so let's start with the Darwin Community Legal Service.
Yes, good afternoon. My name is Judy Harrison. I'm the Principal Solicitor at the Darwin Community Legal Service.
We've got others with us from the Community Legal Service.
There were going to be, but they're actually in Nhulunbuy doing outreach and we couldn't manage the technology. So it's just me.
Right. Thanks, Ms. Harrison then. Okay, so Legal Aid New South Wales.
Good afternoon. It's Rochelle Johnston, Senior Solicitor in the NDIS and Social Security team.
Thanks, Ms. Johnston. And Queensland Advocacy.
My name's Matilda Alexander. I'm the Chief Executive Officer at QAI.
And my name is Sophie Wiggins and I'm a Systems Advocate at QAI.
Thank you. Okay, so look, I now invite you each to make a brief opening statement if you'd like to do so. And after that, us committee members will ask you some questions. So starting with the Darwin Community Legal Service.
Yes, thank you, Senator Rice. So the Darwin Community Legal Service made a submission to this inquiry, which was one of 6 from the Northern Territory, which have been submitted. The others were by the NPY Women's Council, Danila Dilba, which is the Aboriginal Health Service based in Darwin, the Central Australian Aboriginal Congress, the North Australian Aboriginal Justice Agency, and the Aboriginal Medical Service Alliance for the NT. The submissions largely focus on the same things. One of the themes in these submissions is the higher prevalence of disability among Aboriginal people in the Northern Territory, particularly among Aboriginal people living in remote areas of the NT. The DCLS submission includes a remote area case study relating to Ramingining, which is a community in East Arnhem. I'm not going to go through that case study, but in terms of the nuts and bolts of how the DSP is operating in remote communities, we think that that's fairly representative. In a nutshell, DSP is failing comprehensively in the Northern Territory. It's failing for locational reasons, for cultural reasons, for reasons to do with the requirements, the inability to access the necessary forms of assessment and the rates of payment. The submission also deals with the lack of a human rights framework or principles underpinning DSP. We contrast that with the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the legislation for which does start with some principles. And we also, in our submission, using case studies, highlight issues for our clients. Something to note is that the Darwin Community Legal Service has 3 parts of our service, and it's unique in this respect. So we have a Seniors and Disability Rights Service with advocates who are mainly trained in social work. Then there's the General Legal Service, which includes Social Security legal help, and the Tenants Advice Service, which relates to all tenants. It is a socio-legal practice. We collaborate across those teams, and all of the teams are working with people who are trying to get onto the DSP or who are on the DSP and have experienced problems. In referring to our general legal service that does social security legal help work, it's important to make the point that there is no specific funding for this work in the Northern Territory or nationally. And by that I mean there is no funding program relating to social security legal help in Australia. So if the government was asked the question, how much money are you contributing for social security legal help, there wouldn't be an answer to that question. So it's not possible to answer that question. There's been no needs assessment about the legal needs of DSP applicants or recipients, and the same applies to social security recipients generally. Our legal service is struggling to provide adequate legal help. We can't provide adequate legal help to applicants for DSP. So in terms of the key points that I've been asked to express, so this is from the 3 parts of our legal service. Our first number 1 point for our clients is the difficulty in accessing specialist health services to satisfy the assessment requirements for DSP, particularly due to location. Remote location, regional location, and access to the required specialists. Secondly, that the impairment tables don't reflect modern best practice about health and function assessments, and they don't take into account cultural differences. And thirdly, that the process of applying for the DSP often has a detrimental effect on people's mental and physical health. Senator Rice, you referred to a cost-benefit analysis undertaken by Services Australia. We think that there is massive cost shifting going on in the way that DSP is structured in terms of the effects on local services and agencies picking up the pieces, and that the Commonwealth needs to do much more to carry the weight. The reason that 2 members of our team that were going to present with me are not available is that they are in East Arnhem consulting with community people on the NT disability strategy. That strategy is on the receiving end of the DSP and a number of other Commonwealth programs. And the inability to really get traction for people who are on DSP or wanting to get onto DSP at a territory level is attributable to the failure of the DSP at a Commonwealth level. So we think that comprehensive reform is needed for the Northern Territory. The others who have submitted from the Northern Territory have made those points in their own ways themselves. So we think that there is a crisis and it needs to be faced, and real solutions are needed.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Ms Harrison. Legal Aid New South Wales.
Thank you. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the committee for inviting Legal Aid New South Wales to give evidence before you today. As an opening statement, I wish to highlight the current processes, evidentiary requirements, and legislative provisions that are prohibitive for people with disabilities claiming the DSP by presenting a typical legal aid client journey in this area. In our experience, a client with, for example, a mental health condition and some contributory back pain will struggle to understand the eligibility criteria for the DSP and to obtain evidence about their conditions and program of support participation. The person will first need to complete a claim form and attach raw evidence. Since 2015, there is no available form that they can give their doctors asking for commentary on their diagnosis, treatment history, symptoms, and capacity to work. The person is unlikely at this stage to have ever heard of the program of support requirement. If their claim is assessed by a job capacity assessor, the assessor may not have expertise in mental health and may recommend treatment options that have not been suggested by the person's treating specialists. If a job capacity assessor finds the person meets the criteria for the DSP, they'll be required to meet with a government contracted doctor. This will be another one-off assessment, largely on the papers. If the claim is refused, the person will likely get a letter that explains they did not obtain 20 impairment points. This letter will not advise them of the other criteria they also need to meet to obtain the DSP, including the program of support requirement. If the person appeals the refusal, an authorised review officer will reassess their claim. Their written decision will not outline all of the DSP criteria that needs to be met and whether the person met it. The decision will only address the first criteria at which the person did not qualify. This person may eventually then appeal to the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. At this point, they may find out that their mental health condition cannot be counted for this claim from a year ago, as it has not been diagnosed by a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist, as is required by Table 5 of the Social Security Impairment Tables. This may be the case even if the person has undertaken years of treatment with a registered psychologist. The person may at this point also find out about the program of support requirement to get the DSP. They may realise they have been providing medical certificates to Centrelink for a number of years, exempting them from having to participate in program activities. This time will not count towards the 18-month requirement to meet the program of support requirement. They will struggle to get the evidence they need to show their program attendance, as is required by Clause 7.6 of the Program of Support Determination. They will struggle to get information about the terms of their program, including how the program addresses their specific needs. There is no form available from Centrelink that they can give to their program of support provider to obtain this information. It may take this person 4 or 5 claims, a number of appeals over 1 to 2 years to illustrate they meet the complex criteria to obtain the DSP. This typical client journey has informed our submission to the inquiry and in particular has led us to make the specific recommendations for changes in relation to the claim form process, the assessment process, some of the impairment tables, and in particular the program of support requirement. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms Johnston. It's laid it out very clearly. So now, Queensland Advocacy Inc., do you wish to make an opening statement?
Good afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to take part in this public hearing today. And we'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land upon which we gather, which here is the Turrbal and Jagera peoples. We pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people with a disability, including our President, Byron Albury. QAI is an independent, community-based advocacy organisation and community legal centre that advocates for people with disability. Our mission is to advocate for the protection and advancement of the needs, rights and lives of people with disability in Queensland. Our management committee is comprised of a majority of people with disability whose wisdom and lived experience is our foundation and guide. While QAI does not provide individual advocacy support specifically in relation to the disability support pension, our extensive experience supporting Queenslanders with disability over the years has highlighted to us its many inadequacies. Everyone has a right to an adequate standard of living, regardless of their disability status. This includes being able to earn a minimum wage, or for those who cannot work due to their disability, being able to rely on income security payments that do not equate to living a life in poverty. Article 28 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities confers an obligation on state parties to ensure people with disability can access adequate food, housing, clothing and social protection measures. The realisation of this right is also connected to the enjoyment of other basic human rights, such as the right to health, the right to work and the right to live independently in the community. It's critical to Australia's obligations under the CRPD and must be prioritised accordingly. QAI considers that the disability support pension in its current form has lost its purpose, is unreasonable in its eligibility criteria, fails to account for discrimination within the labour market, is inadequate in monetary value and fails to acknowledge the economic benefits of improved income support payments for people with disability.
The best way to illustrate this is by sharing the story of a person with disability who has been in receipt of the disability support pension his whole life. Let's call him John. When asked about his experiences as a DSP recipient, John said, "Outside of paying bills, there is nothing left. I am forced to make impossible choices as it is not physically possible to live off the amount of money you get. I cannot go anywhere as I don't have enough money, so I am socially isolated. The stress and indignity of reporting to Centrelink, the lack of self-worth and dignity you feel. I am already in a wheelchair and not earning $70,000 a year like most people. So to then have to watch what I buy at the grocery store and not have a social life because I can't afford to go out, it's really hard. To not be able to support my family, my wife, this hurts. Despite it being a stable payment, people view it negatively and banks turn you away, yet they give loans to people with jobs that could end at any moment. How can people be expected to be in good enough shape to apply for and sustain work if you can't meet your basic needs and are living below the breadline? What are we meant to prioritise? If I do try and work, I have to keep proving myself and my disability over and over again. If we are wanting to make people feel valued, members of society, we need to increase the amount. This is about helping the most vulnerable people have a better quality of life. We therefore need an approach that considers the broader economic benefits of improving the financial security of people living with disability and its associated impacts on health, well-being, capacity to engage in employment, and consequences for families and carers. Our social security system must adequately support all people with disability to enjoy a standard of living that we would all consider reasonable. For those who can participate in the workforce, it must support them in a way that upholds their dignity whilst preserving and encouraging their opportunities for employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Alexander. Look, I want to start perhaps with the Darwin Community Legal Service. I mean, thank you all for those statements, which just very, laid out very clearly about what the issues are and how people surviving on the DSP or even less, people with disabilities, it's a massive struggle. Ms. Harrison, in your submission, you also talked about the issues with people who then are imprisoned and so in custody for periods of time. And we know, particularly sort of working with our Indigenous population, that we've got a much greater proportion of people sort of being incarcerated for a whole range of reasons. Can you talk us through, in addition then to what some of the issues associated with that situation are?
Yes. So one of the situations is that people are on DSP when they go to prison, that they cease to be on DSP while they are in prison, and once they come out of prison, that they start the whole process again of applying and providing reports and so forth. So while people are in the phase of trying to re-establish themselves, that's a pretty big ordeal for them to be going through post-release. So some better process than that doesn't anticipate that things have changed when usually that's not going to be the case. So they're usually going to continue to be eligible unless the rules have changed in the meantime. Where people are preparing for release, there's limited resources on the part of services that are working for them to link them up with services that can help anticipate the DSP application process. Where people are leaving prison and they're not on the right payment, they can end up breached. And so that can also cause a chain of other issues. So more thinking is needed about DSP and prisoners, including remandees, and more preparation for release and getting back on the DSP.
Do you know what the rationale with them being, no longer eligible for the DSP after being incarcerated for a period of time is? Is there any rationale that's given?
Well, there's two parts of that. So the first part of that is that they're in prison, and so the financial circumstances are different to being out and about. The second seems to be quite opportunistic, that it's an opportunity to save the money, and so people would cease to be eligible and then need to reapply. And assuming that the various criteria relating to DSP then need to be rechecked. So rather than working on an assumption that things perhaps haven't changed and that the onus should actually reflect that, it just all starts all over again. So it seems to be a cost-cutting measure.
Okay. Ms. Johnston, your opening statement laid out the multiple barriers for people to be able to access the DSP. As you talk through them, it struck me that most of these, with a properly designed process that was actually designed to help people, should be able to be overcome. Do you think, how much of the problem, and versus other evidence that we've received, that basically the whole structure of the DSP is fundamentally broken, needs to be completely rethought from the ground up? How much do you think it would be enough to just step through this and improve things at each of those places that people are being rejected, or how much does the whole process need to be have a total rethink?
Yes, thank you. We certainly echo some of the comments that have been made today about the inadequacy of the amount of payment the disability support pension reflects. And in our submission, we tried to address some of the barriers that we often see from our experience representing clients at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal who've been through the process for a number of years. So, in tackling that question, I think that we need to look at the payment rate and level of poverty and the statistics and qualitative and quantitative data there is to show that the payment is too small for people with significant disabilities to survive on in multitude of different geographical environments. But the recommendations we made were largely around practical ways that we think could make substantial changes if it were to be that the entire payment is not redesigned or rethought. So maximum level of efficiency changes or removing some of those barriers that people with complex disabilities face with the current operation of the DSP as it stands right now, with the same legislative provisions, generally the same eligibility criteria. But certainly also echo that there are a number of other issues to do with the disability support pension and the rate of payment.
Could I ask each of you to talk through what you see the problems with the impairment tables as they currently work are? Perhaps starting with Queensland Advocacy.
We might let someone else start with that one. We don't actually do individualised advocacy around the DSP.
Okay.
The only comment I would make, though, is that it seems to apply very sort of arbitrary classifications of disability and taking very much a deficit approach to the concept of disability, which is very much at odds with the social model of disability, which this whole system should be based upon. So when we talk about redesigning the system, it needs to very much be starting from that point of view in our perspective. But sort of this approach of literally giving people numerical scores based upon perceived levels of impairment is just totally the wrong way of thinking. And for a person to be able to qualify with 20 points on one table but not 20 points from multiple tables, again, it continues to misunderstand the realities of what disability is and living with the implications of multiple conditions. So Yeah, I understand that.
And,
Yeah,
how,
thank you.
and how does that information get to the table in the first place? You have to have an ability to get those reports done, pay for those reports, and appropriate people available to even write those reports. So there's a whole lot of issues behind the scenes of those tables.
Yes, I think it's really useful reflections and observations. Ms. Johnston?
Yes, thank you. In our submission, we did go through some specific issues that we've identified with tables 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and I can certainly speak to those issues in more information if required. Overall, though, in answering that question, it appears since the introduction of the impairment tables as they currently exist right now in 2012, it's significantly harder to obtain impairment points from the tables that existed prior to 2012. Particularly, we think that is the case for people who have a mental health condition, so that the descriptors as they currently exist to obtain 5, 10, 20 or 30 impairment points is significantly harder for a number of conditions, particularly for mental health conditions. I did want to highlight in our submission, we particularly identified the impact of some of the use of terminology and words in some of the tables. For example, the use of the words without assistance in tables 1, which is to do with functions requiring physical exertion and stamina, and table 3, which is the table for lower limb function. The description requires somebody to show that they require assistance from another person. And we find in our experience, giving advice weekly and representation at the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, that a number of people with significant disabilities that would not be able to work, that would have a significantly reduced functional capacity in those domains, cannot possibly obtain 20 impairment points under either of those tables because they can stand from a chair, stand from a seated position in a chair because of assistive equipment. So I think some of the tables don't envisage the advances that have been made with specialist equipment that people may have at the moment, and certainly underrate the level of impairment that people would have in terms of their capacity to work in the future. So the tables that we've identified are the ones that we see most with our client base, and that are most difficult to be able to show a 10 or a 20 impairment point rating.
That's a really good point. I think of my elderly mother who's very frail at 89, but can still, get herself out of a chair and sort of, walk to the front door with her walker. But she can do that unassisted. Yes, and so
Yes.
certainly.
Yeah, we've certainly seen a number of applicants before the Administrative Appeals Tribunal in relation to that specific issue, and the way that the tables are constructed in showing that one criteria or another needs to be met, or that all of the criteria need to be met, can simply rule out some people entirely because of that very definition.
Thanks. Ms. Harrison, did you have comments that you'd like to make on the impairment tables?
Yes, I do. First of all, some of the submissions to the Northern Territory have recommended that end-stage kidney failure and hemodialysis be added to the impairment tables. Also that the impairment tables need to reflect people's lives and the things that they do in their lives in a more realistic way. The impairment tables are frequently not culturally appropriate. They also don't translate, so the language is hard to translate. We would endorse the points that have been by the others making submissions. So the inability to reflect more complex circumstances. So the fact that the tables are individual tables rather than including a mechanism for the tables to be properly related to each other and for impairments and the effects of those impairments to properly register on the tables. Overall, we're concerned that the whole focus is on impairment rather than building people's capacity. We think that a more positive approach, which focuses on what people can do rather than what they can't do, would be more productive. We think that the whole reference to impairment needs to be rethought, and an approach which is recognising how people can contribute, what they want to do in their lives, the things that they can do, that they can contribute to their communities, to their families, would be more constructive.
Thank you. Can I move on to the experience of your clients and with employment services, and both mainstream and disability employment services, and what the experience of those is and their interaction with the DSP? I would like to start with that.
Well, I can start. So the experience of a high proportion of our clients is that employment services are not useful for them, that they're not receiving, they don't have access to the types of supports and assistance that they require, that the structure of DSP doesn't facilitate economic participation, and it imagines that people will be on DSP and not doing much else. So we'd prefer an approach that was much more facilitative, that was empowering and was positive and constructive, and enabled people to advance their standard of living, and also to advance their well-being and including their economic well-being while they're on DSP.
Thank you.
I'm happy to speak next. Overwhelmingly, the information we're given from clients is that they are often supported by their employment service provider, their job active provider or disability employment service provider to obtain the DSP if they are not yet in receipt of the disability support pension. And the largest issue that we face in a legal context with seeking reviews or representation is to try to assist that person to navigate the criteria for the disability support pension in terms of the activities they need to have done to qualify from their job active provider or disability employment service provider, and trying to get the relevant documentation for them. And it seems to be a bit of a disjunct in the sense of someone's often supported to apply for the DSP and to get an exemption from having to attend their program of support. But at the same time, in applying for an exemption to attend the program of support, they're not going to be able to illustrate that they meet the program of support requirement for the disability support pension. So it seems to be quite a circular issue. This is, in our experience, the biggest issue at present for people claiming the disability support pension who have a number of medical documents and disabilities, but are not able to obtain the disability support pension. Overwhelmingly, there seems to be an issue with showing they demonstrate the program of support. And we've made some recommendations in relation to, in our experience, some changes that may assist those people to liaise with their program support provider for the purposes of obtaining the disability support pension.
I mean, we've heard a lot of evidence about the program of support and how a lot of submitters to it have said that it should be abolished, that it's not achieving any outcome, that it's just putting a blockage and a delay. Do your clients get any value out of it? Do you see that it should be retained in any form, or do you think also that it should be abolished?
Overwhelmingly, the majority of clients that we have access to are seeking the disability support pension. So they're currently on Job Seeker, putting in a claim for the disability support pension and have been refused and come and get some advice from legal aid and are seeking help with the appeals process. So the majority of clients have reported that they have not obtained any benefit from their program support and ultimately have been recommended to apply for the disability support pension. So we don't, our experience is not that there's a large client base seeking to continue a program of support and there's particular goals and activities that they're participating in that is assisting them. It's more often for us, you know, what do I need to do in terms of the program support? What is the program of support? How do I meet it in that respect for a DSP claim form?
Thank you. Queensland Advocacy.
Yeah, I think that when we're talking about the DSP, we have to look at it in the broader context. And we certainly find that there is still endemic discrimination against people with a disability in the larger labour market. And that is one of the factors that feeds into the demands and the needs for the DSP. In our submission, we also talked about Australian disability enterprises and productivity-based wage assessment tools where people with a disability are paid according to their productivity, whereas the rest of us are paid according to our hourly rate. And I guess the discriminatory nature of those supported wage systems and the way that they can perpetuate stereotypes of people with a disability in the workforce, and that they shouldn't really be there without these special programs. Whereas what we know is that people with a disability are actually a great benefit to the workplace. They bring higher participation rates, better retention rates, increased diversity in skills and attributes, fewer workplace injuries. So despite all these positives, there is this broader picture of discrimination, which is underneath the issues that we're looking at today.
Thank you. Are there any final comments that any of you would like to make? No? Okay, look, well, thank you very much for your evidence today. It's been really valuable, and for your submissions as well. It's been important evidence for the committee to hear. So we will now suspend for a break and recommence at 3:45.
Thank you.
Thank you.
From the Blind Citizens Australia and from Blind Citizens Australia, Spinal Cord Injuries Australia, and people from the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales. With, I think via video conference, yes, Blind Citizens and Spinal Cord, and the Physical Disabilities Council, you're in person in Parliament House. It's pretty exciting. So thank you for appearing before the committee today. I'm Senator Janet Rice. I'm the chair of the committee, and I've got with me Senator Wendy Askew, who's the deputy chair, and Senator Anne Urquhart. So in order to start us off, could I please ask you each to state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. So starting off with the Blind Citizens Australia.
Good afternoon. This is Jane Britt from Blind Citizens Australia, Policy and Advocacy Team Leader.
Thanks, Ms. Britt.
Hi, my name is Megan Bingham. I'm a Policy and Advocacy Officer from Spinal Cord Injuries Australia.
Thanks, Ms. Bingham.
Hi, my name's Deanna Pedersoli. I'm an advocate for SCIA Australia.
Thanks, Ms. Pedersoli. And the Physical Disabilities Council of New South Wales?
Hi, I'm Serena Ovens, and I'm the CEO of the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales.
And Hayley Stone, Policy Manager of the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales.
Thank you very much. So could I ask you each, if when you're speaking, particularly those on video conference, to speak clearly and to identify, and if you could all identify yourself each time you speak to assist with the recording and the broadcast of these proceedings. I'll now invite you each to make a short opening statement if you'd wish to do so, and then we will ask you some questions. So starting off with Blind Citizens Australia.
Thank you very much. And I would like to say thank you very much to the committee for allowing us to testify today. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm currently coming to you from, the land of the people of the Yagara and Turrbal Nation. I would like to acknowledge elders, past, present and emerging. Blind Citizens Australia is a national representative organisation of people who are blind or vision impaired, allowing them to be empowered, informed and connected to other people who are blind or vision impaired and the wider community. The Disability Support Pension is a major contributor to the economic sustainability of living for people with disability. The DSP is an economic safety net that enables people with disabilities to navigate the higher cost of living due to disabilities and problems gaining and maintaining employment, which leads to economic vulnerability. Today, our opening statement will focus on increased cost of living, compounding issues with gaining and maintaining employment, and finally, on eligibility and access to the scheme. In terms of living costs, the NDIS has only partly alleviated living costs, with many other costs either not covered by the NDIS or people with disabilities not getting budget funding to cover these costs. There are 4.4 million Australians with disabilities, yet approximately 340,000 people only have an NDIS plan. We're already talking about a substantial amount of people with disability without access to the scheme. There are many living costs that people with disabilities have to incur. In terms of housing costs, there is often a forced choice for the person to live in proximity to public transport and community for safety in accessing the community. Other contributing factors for this include a lack of transport in regional and remote areas, a lack of social housing, which has been reported recently by the Disability Royal Commission, cost of rent or mortgage increase in these areas, and a lack of employment or inadequate employment leads to financial strain in meeting these costs. Additional costs may be transport, if a person does not have access to transport funding through the NDIS or state or territory-based taxi subsidy schemes. In terms of medical costs, particularly where costs are related to psychosocial wellbeing, for example, anxiety or depression, there are increased costs that are incurred. These include increased costs for medication, medical appointments, outpatient and inpatient treatment, and medical tests. Although Medicare can support some of these additional costs, the disability support pension is critical without other revenue streams. For example, if someone has chronic pain as a result of their disability, it is not covered by the NDIS. And finally, there's a cumulative cost, including wear and tear due to mobility and navigating the physical environment. Moving on to employment, data from 2019 indicates that 48% of working age people, that is people aged 15 to 64, of people with disability are employed, compared with 79% without disability. In other words, 52% of Australians with disability of working age are unemployed. People with disabilities solely relying on the DSP for their source of income are living below the poverty line. According to a report published by the Australian Council of Social Service, ACOS, with the University of New South Wales, in 2018, just under 4 of the 10 Australians living in poverty have a disability. That is, in other words, 38% of the nearly 2 million Australian adults who are living in poverty, 1 in 6 of them have a disability, compared with just over 1 in 10 Australians without disability. Yet it is known that 43% of people with disabilities of working age receive a government payment, which is their primary source of income. It is also important to note here that gaining employment does not necessarily mean that the level of income will enable people who have disabilities to meet their cost of living outlined earlier. Finally, I'd like to touch on eligibility for the DSP. The initial form used to apply for the DSP is not easy to navigate, does not allow ease of access in filling out the form independently. At present, advocacy support is often needed to navigate eligibility in the instance of inaccurate completion of the form. BCA has also been contacted by numerous members who have blindness which stems from cortical lesions, tumours, stroke, or other traumatic brain injury. Eligibility for the DSP needs to include people who are blind or vision impaired, where the blindness is caused by a neurological base. This needs to be done by considering the functional impact rather than only medical diagnostic criterion. Finally, suboptimal treatment when attending appointments for assessment for DSP criteria needs to be addressed. There needs to be more disability representation in the selection process for the people who are responsible for undertaking assessment. Further, a trauma-informed process needs to be adopted. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Ms. Britt. Okay, we can now hear from Ms. Bingham from the Spinal Cord Injuries Australia.
Thank you, Senator Rice. Spinal Cord Injuries Australia appreciates the opportunity to present evidence before the committee today. I'd like to begin by first acknowledging that I am calling in today from the traditional lands of the Darramaragal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. I am joined by my colleague, Ms. Diana D. Pederzoli, who is an individual advocate part of SCIA's Northern Rivers team. Dee contributed greatly to our submission, providing insights into client stories and providing specific observations on the additional barriers faced by people with disability living in regional and rural areas navigating the DSP process. SCIA's policy and advocacy team operates out of 2 offices in New South Wales, based in Sydney and in the Northern Rivers. Both teams provide individual advocacy services to clients with a range of disabilities in order to assist them navigate the complexities of the DSP application process, as well as stand side by side them in making reviews to Centrelink and the Administrative Appeals Tribunal. Our systemic advocacy work focuses on advocating on behalf of both our clients and our 3,000 SCIA members living across Australia, who include people with spinal and neurological conditions, many of whom are DSP applicants and recipients. As set out in our submission, we firmly believe that the role of the DSP is to provide long-term financial security to people with disability when their disability prevents them from fully engaging in employment opportunities. However, as our submission also details, there are several administrative hurdles embedded within the present process, as well as in the culture of Centrelink staff that can result in lengthy delays, traumatizing application experiences, and eligible recipients resorting to withdrawing their applications altogether or compromising by applying for the job seeker and receiving a lower rate of payment. These effects not only impact the financial security of people with disability, but also affect several other interrelated domains of their lives, including family relationships, housing stability, confidence in taking next steps towards finding employment that matches their career aspirations, and compromising on their continuity of care from their treating medical professionals. SCIA's recommendations focus primarily on improving supports to navigate the DSP application, review, and appeals processes by investing in information, referrals to legal and non-legal advocacy support services, and coordinating with health professionals to better assist them to understand the impairment tables and legislative provisions for supporting medical evidence. Additionally, Centrelink staff need to be better trained in adopting a trauma-informed approach and providing better supports to build trust with DSP applicants and recipients. Finally, there needs to be further investigation and consultation on the impact of the current inadequate DSP rate and how it affects people with disabilities' standard of living, which we know is already compromised when we look to statistics on the poorer health, housing, and employment outcomes for people with disability. This needs to be considered in the context that many people may or may not be receiving supports from multiple funding streams outside the social security system in order to meet the higher costs of living with disability. The government needs to better recognise the purpose of the DSP as a factor in a wider system of government supports that empower people with disability to live independently, realise their human rights, and strive to achieve their individual goals. If we have time, Senator, I'd like to briefly pass to my colleague, Dee, who can provide insight specifically into the experiences of people living in regional and rural areas.
Thanks, Ms. Bingham. Yes. Ms. Pedasoli.
Thank you, Senator. So while working at SCIA's Regional Northern Rivers office, my advocate colleagues and I have found 3 key issues that need to be addressed to provide user-friendly service more in line with people who have a disability. So regional and rural communities have trouble accessing bulk billing GPs and other medical professionals, such as clinical psychologists, as these regional areas have difficulty attracting and retaining these medical professionals. This leads to long wait lists and medical professionals who are so time poor, they often refuse to complete the DSP paperwork as they find it takes too long and is far too complicated. This puts the person with the disability at further disadvantage. A simplified, more user-friendly form needs to be implemented along with a simple assistance manual for all GPs to be able to refer to. The second key issue is that clients are often so distressed by the Centrelink staff not giving clear information or giving conflicting information that the client does not understand. Centrelink staff need additional training in working with people with disabilities, particularly with those with mental health conditions. The final key issue is that reforms must be made so that all additional medical evidence can be considered at the tribunal level. As it currently stands, only evidence supplied with the application plus an additional 13 weeks will be assessed. The assessor will not view anything submitted after this time. This results in further delays and undue stress to the person with a disability being able to access the correct government support payment. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms. Pettersoli. Okay, the Physical Disability Council of New South Wales.
Thank you. It's Serena again. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the various lands on which we meet today and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. The Physical Disability Council of New South Wales is a systemic advocacy peak for more than 1 million people living with physical disability in New South Wales, including younger people and people with physical disabilities that relate to age. We champion the rights of our members, both under the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and domestic statutory instruments, including the Disability Discrimination Act and the National Disability Strategy. We very much welcome the opportunity to appear as witnesses before the Community Affairs References Committee today to share our views, our members' views, on the purpose, intent and adequacy of the DSP. The DSP, as you are no doubt aware, is the main economic safety net for some 750,000 people who have the reduced capacity to work on account of their disabilities. Many PDCN members are DSP recipients or have been on the DSP at some point. For some, the DSP will be their primary income for the majority of their adult lives. At its full rate, the DSP in a fortnight is $967.50 for a single person. But we know that there is a monetary cost of disability, approximately $173 a week on average for a person with profound or severe disability, and $87 per week on average for a person with mild or moderate disability. This means a person with disability already starts with a deficit that brings them close to, or if not under, the OECD poverty line of 60% of median household income measure. People with disability of working age are also less likely to own a home, so there is often the additional costs associated with renting. Here we see a picture start to develop. People on the DSP can't afford meals, pay for medications, buy clothes. They struggle to pay their rent or their utilities. Therefore, they can't heat or cool their homes. For the lucky ones, this is a temporary situation, but for many more, it's not. It's long-term, entrenched poverty. This is in direct contradiction to the human rights accorded to people with disability under the UN CRPD, and it is Australia's shame. We can do better, and we should do better. Under the United Nations CRPD, Australia is obligated to provide an adequate standard of living for people with disabilities and their families, extending to ensure that people with disability and their families have access to food, clothing and housing, as well as disability-specific needs. Access to an appropriate level of DSP, as Australia's social security payments specific for people with disability, should be viewed as an execution of Australia's human rights commitments that benefits not only those with disabilities, but their families and the broader community. At the same time, we've seen, through mechanisms such as the NDIS, a much-needed transition from a medicalised model of disability to recognising that people with disability have the right to live enriched and fulfilling lives as active citizens and members of their communities. The DSP, as it currently exists, is a legacy from a welfare mentality that is increasingly out of step with our society, and rightly so. We need to take a hard look at what it means to live a dignified life in the Australian context and consider whether it is right that a person, through no fault of their own, should live in poverty for years at a time with limited opportunities to change that, because that's where we stand at the moment. Our recommendations to the committee have included the setup of a Social Security Commission to determine, amongst other things, the working definition of poverty within an Australian context, and an investigation into the appropriateness of the DSP as income support in line with Australia's international and domestic commitments to people with disability. These recommendations are a pragmatic acknowledgement that, at this point in time, our government will not shift on increasing the DSP regardless of the groundswell of support from the Australian community that we've particularly seen recently during the pandemic, when things have been even harder for those on limited incomes. We know the ideological factors that drive current social welfare policy in Australia, and we challenge their applicability in the context of the DSP. It is our sincere hope that in this inquiry, things will lead to a substantial change for the better, and we welcome questions from the committee. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ms Evans. Look, I might kick off with you and your recommendations for a Social Security Commission and independent investigation. Can you just expand on what that would look like and what sort of engagement, consultation, and how would you set that off? What would it look like in terms of completely rethinking and re-looking at the way that we provide the DSP or equivalent support service for people with disabilities?
Thank you. I think, as you said, what we need to do firstly is look at what actually is reasonable. And to do that, setting up a committee needs to be one that is broad, that contains obviously government, professionals with experience and people with lived experience, to look at what it actually means to be on the DSP, what the other factors in their life are part of this issue, and how we can find an appropriate point that means people can live their lives and engage in community and have a fulfilled and equitable life. I'll hand to my colleague Hayley Stone to provide a broader remit around that for you.
So I guess one of the problems that arises when we consider the DSP and people who are on lower socioeconomic payments is really we don't have a very clear definition about what poverty is in the Australian context. And I think that would be really a starting place of any work that the committee would do, would be to actually formalise an understanding of what poverty means, and that poverty should be relative to our standard of living. I agree with Serena. I think that what we do need to do is we need to take a broad approach here. We need to incorporate people who have experience working with people with disability, who have experience around the economic drivers of poverty and inequality. We need to engage entities that can provide some very solid research in terms of cost of living and how that impacts on the rate of the DSP and the mechanisms around how the DSP is currently determined. Because one of the things that we know is that the DSP has remained relatively consistent, whereas the cost of living continues to increase. And these things are very complicated questions. They're questions that can be very difficult to understand. Cost of living in itself is very, very difficult. So, you do need to bring in that expertise to drive something like this.
So I presume from your submission and your evidence today that you are very much arguing that people with disability should have income that leaves them above the poverty line, however that's determined. Look, I've sort of put a bit of a devil's advocate question to you because of the very substantial cost that would entail for the sort of government outlays in order to do that. And just, can you tell us the rationale and the benefits of doing that, which would outweigh those costs?
So, like anything, if we can bring people to a point where they can both be supported to live adequately but also be able to work where they can, we engage people in the community and in an economic situation. So there is a point where we can give back. However, if you're putting someone below the poverty line and making it difficult for them, particularly we know in the most recent years we're seeing a decline in the number of people that are able to access the DSP and that are put onto things like Job Start. And they very much are hesitant to take that next step, to commit to working and committing to earning an income if it means that they may end up taking a backward step, ending off the DSP and put in a much poorer situation with very little chance of being able to get back onto it. So in engaging in a situation where we might have to put more money up front but give the people capacity to be economically viable within their own capacity, we then hopefully in the longer term ensure that everybody can engage both socially and economically within the community.
Thank you. Look, I've move on to the Spinal Cord Injuries Australia, and in your submission and your opening statement, you talked about the attitude of Centrelink staff and the fact that people don't feel supported by Centrelink staff. I'm wondering whether you might be able to expand on that and perhaps, share some particular or individual stories, perhaps Ms. Pederasoli, from your work in New South Wales in regional areas, just to give a bit more give us a bit more understanding of how people find that engagement with the Centrelink staff.
Sure. So just so you guys have an understanding that regional areas, unlike metro areas, the Centrelink offices are few and far between. Obviously, if someone's on a DSP, money's really tight. So in order to drive to a Centrelink office, because majority of people don't want to wait an hour and a half to 2 hours on the phone to get through, they have to drive at least half an hour to 45 minutes to a Centrelink office. And so that's over an hour and a half round trip. So number one, there's a cost factor, only to be told when they come into that service that often there's, and I can only speak for Northern Rivers, a lot of our social workers that should be in each Centrelink office have been taken away over the years. So therefore they can only be accessed over the phone. So that person then has to go in and sit on a phone or wait for a social worker to call them back. So I think that that's one of the barriers. Thank you.
Thank you. Look, I've got a question for the Blind Citizens Australia, Ms. Britt. I just wanted a bit more detail about the issues with people who are blind accessing DSP, because I think, can you just talk us through why it's not universal that if you're blind that you're able to access the DSP? Because I think that's what I understood it to be.
Yeah, certainly. So I will also like to acknowledge that we've been joined by my colleague Emma Benison, who's Chief Executive Officer of Blind Citizens Australia. I will also pass to Emma for comment as well. The main thing around this is that if someone is experiencing vision loss that has been functionally, is for all intents and purposes the same as blindness as caused by the eye, that's caused by a cortical issue. So it might be a lesion or tumour or that equivalent sort of organic impact. That it still nonetheless is assessed as something that is psychosomatic sometimes, and that is problematic. We've heard time and time again from our members that for people who have blindness of this nature, that it's often not treated with the same level of gravity of the functional impact. And therefore, quite a number of them have had issues in accessing various schemes. That includes the DSP, that includes the NDIS, and accessing other state and territory-based schemes because of the root cause of their blindness. Emma, did you have something else you would like to add?
Yeah, thank you, Senator. Just to say that the other challenge that people experience, I think, which we haven't really touched on today, is oftentimes disability is acquired, as you know, and so people, and we've heard a lot about trauma-informed approaches, but I think the important thing to understand here is that if people have acquired their impairment, they're not necessarily used to talking about it. They may have experienced a trauma. They may not even themselves understand what their functional capacity is. And then to be put in front of a health professional who, quite frankly, sometimes they are brutal. Many of them are wonderful, but sometimes they are brutally rude and disrespectful at a time when people are at their lowest ebb, is not really the best time to be assessing their functional capacity. And so that is why not all people with disability actually succeed in getting their entitlement, because they're not, it's not always assessed appropriately. So that can be a real challenge for people. Thank you.
Thanks, Ms Benison. I might hand over to Senator Askew to ask some questions.
Thank you very much, Chair, and thank you everybody for making yourselves available today and for your extensive submissions and also opening statements and comments today. The Chair has touched on a couple of my questions, but I just had a couple of others. I think it was Ms Britt, in your opening statement, you were talking about there wasn't an understanding around blindness being caused by neurological illness. Can you just elaborate a bit more on that and how you see that being, what blockages and obstacles are put in front of people with blindness in that way?
Yeah, sure. So I think what we have heard repeatedly from our membership is that where someone has blindness that is caused by a neurological cause, there's often years of investigation, a lot of misunderstanding exactly about what is the nature of the root cause of it. And despite the functional impact being the same, for example, the person loses their independence to drive, loses their ability to have mobility in their local environments and might need a mobility aid like a cane or a assistance dog, that for, all intents and purposes, the experience of that person's blindness is equivalent to someone else that may have lost sight through a cause like glaucoma or retinitis pigmentosa, but the cause itself is the eye. But because of the extensive amount of medical investigation that often underpins trying to understand the root cause of the functional impact of the blindness, the person doesn't fall into a discrete category per se, and oftentimes the person will be given a diagnosis of functional neurological disorder. In other words, it's deemed to be psychosomatic, whereas the root cause of it still, it's irrespective of the fact that the functional impact of it is still the same as if it were for someone who had blindness or vision impairment caused by a different type of blindness. That might be, as I said, like a glaucoma or, macular degeneration.
So would that be the reason be around the obstacle being that it may not be permanent? Is that the bit that's missing when they need to apply for the DSP?
Well, what we often see with, even generally with blindness is that there is a fluctuating impact. So for someone, the ability to be able to see something under bright light might be quite different to nighttime where you've got low light or no light. It also might be, attributed to a number of other factors like fatigue and the chronic pain that comes from that visual fatigue that then impacts what the person can see. So yes, there is a fluctuating impact of it, but there's also that it probably is something that can be permanent in that the person has the functional impact ongoing from the point at which they might have a stroke, for example, then they have that functional impact from that point onwards of actually, for all intents and purposes, being blind. But because the discrete cause can't be categorised quite clearly, then that's where the problem lies.
It would also depend, I suppose, where that sits on the impairment tables and things that go from that point on. Yeah. I just wanted to clarify your comment. That was all just in my mind. Thank you for that. And I think Ms Evans might have been in your submission. I noticed you were talking about ways that we could look at fixing things. And one of your solutions or suggestions was that the government could also look at increasing current income limits so that people on the DSP who work could utilise these earnings to engage in community with reduced impact on the ability to cover their basic living costs. Could you elaborate a little bit further on that, please?
Certainly. So obviously we believe, as I think many others that have spoken today, that the DSP is not adequate to meet even basic income needs of people with physical disability and other disabilities. We would like to see the DSP raised to actually meet what would be reasonable need, particularly because on top of income we have disability needs, and those disability costs are often considerable, as we mentioned. So ensuring that we can bring the income up to a level where they not only meet their basic needs to survive, they meet their medical or disability needs, but they are also able to engage in the community, which we know changes people's well-being and health and then can increase their ability to provide and to be engaged. And again, I might pass to Hayley to talk more around this area for you.
Yes, so just to follow on from what Ms Ovens has said, we appreciate that the DSP is supposed to cover the basic everyday costs of an individual. And one of the concerns for us, and something which has become very clear when we look at the NDIS and its model of supporting people with disabilities, is that the NDIS very much considers that community engagement and participation is key to positive outcomes for people with disability and is key to people realising social inclusion. So when we were talking about the idea of having the current income rates that a person could obtain through paid employment, which at the moment is a very short, like very, very limited amount of income that they can generate before their DSP starts to become affected. We were saying that one of the things that could be done is that money could be, in essence, quarantined off so that the individual could utilise that funding that they have self-generated for the purposes of community engagement and participation. So rather than increasing the DSP to account for what we see as an essential component being social inclusion activities similar to what is under the NDIS, that the individual, through increasing their income limits, could potentially allow them to be able to self-fund those activities. Now, that might be good for some people, those that do have the capacity to work, but we do acknowledge that a significant amount of people on the DSP don't have that capacity. So that would only really be a solution, a partial solution to resolving this issue that we see as being very fundamental, which is that we have people who may be getting their living costs met, their basic living costs. I mean, we would say that they aren't, but we do see that there is this gap that definitely isn't being met, which is around the capacity to engage in community. And what we're talking about here is things like the capacity to go and buy a coffee at a coffee shop with your friends. You know, the thing is you may have food for a meal, but you're not getting that capacity to engage. And there's so many sociological impacts of that, and that's what we really need to see addressed.
Thanks for the clarification. I just want to explore that one little bit further in a different way. So I understand that there's a lot of people on DSP who can't work, but where there is an opportunity where they can and have that engagement in the workforce, do you see or have you seen evidence where people have limited their amount of work that they've accepted so they didn't want to impact their DSP? So if there was an opportunity to lift the limits, that therefore they would engage more and take up further activity?
We couldn't give you absolute evidence of individuals, but I do believe that there are people that are very careful, as you would be if you were concerned about being taken off the DSP. As some of the ladies mentioned previously, for people where their health can fluctuate in particular, there may be times where they can work a little more, but they're equally aware of times where they may be unwell and unable to work at all. So ensuring that they are still covered for those times when they can't work, as opposed to the times where they might be able to do a little more, means that they will be very, very careful to ensure that they can sustain their basic needs over their full lifespan.
And that makes sense, and I understand the complexities around all that, but I was just thinking it may be one way that we could look at assisting with a recommendation going forward, that as long as they provide that protection for them for their DSP.
Absolutely.
Especially in fluctuating illnesses and so on.
For sure, and I think many people...
So that in the last few hearings as well. Okay, just a question for all of you, I suppose, is around the program of support, and most of your organisations would have clients who are involved in perhaps being on the seeker as opposed to DSP, or in that period of application where they're on the program of support. Have you seen evidence that there's been difficulty gaining exemptions for it, or that, you know, for people with disabilities, or is there evidence there?
Sorry, we're losing some of the words.
So did anyone hear that? Sorry, I'm going to stay still when I talk. Okay, so
yeah, I heard that. So you were talking about the question of people on programs of support like the Job Seeker program, and whether people are in fact struggling to deal with the regulations around those programs while they're waiting to get on DSP. Is that right?
That's right. And whether or not there was, whether they were able to get the exemptions applied if they were, unable to work.
To work, yeah. I mean, just briefly, because we don't have a lot of experience of this, but certainly what we do have experience of in recent times, and I think this has been more of an administrative error, but it's caused enormous undue stress to people, is people who are blind or vision impaired who are on the DSP but being subjected to those job search requirements when in fact they shouldn't be, because they're exempt from that. But we have had lots of issues with people struggling with that and having to spend hours and hours literally on the phone, myself included, by the way, to Centrelink, trying to sort that out. So, yeah.
So could you just elaborate on that? So is it on JobSeeker or on DSP?
So no, this is people on DSP who've suddenly been requested to report their income and in some cases their job seeking habits. And it was just an error, an administrative error. But this is the kind of thing that really does cause, enormous stress to people.
Oh, okay. Thank you for that. I hadn't heard of that one.
I don't know whether Ms. Britt has any more information that she wants to share on that. But
no, Emma, nothing additional to that, but I was going to mention the same thing, that we've had numerous advocacy cases come through requesting support about suddenly needing to report this, and then when we actually investigated it, we discovered that there was an administrative error.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. Has any of the other organisations experienced similar situations?
This is Megan from Spinal Cord Injuries Australia. I think our experience in this area is relatively limited, but I think for a lot of people, particularly those with acquired injuries, generally speaking, for advocates, when they receive new clients, often it's in the case of distress, and so the review has already gone into Centrelink for the DSP application. So in the interim, JobSeeker is used as a stopgap measure, usually, just to ensure that people aren't left in financial limbo for extended periods of time. And generally, anecdotally, I can only speak to anecdote from individual advocates in our Sydney team. It has been relatively easy, anything with Centrelink is complex, but easier to get the medical exemption via JobSeeker than the DSP, a successful DSP application. But I think it's very much interconnected to the more general issues surrounding health professionals' understanding of the impairment tables and providing supporting medical evidence.
Okay, thank you. So no other comments? Okay, the only other question I had was around obviously there's a lot of evidence to be gathered with the DSP application and with just the difficulties that have been experienced by your clients in regarding to, first of all, obtaining the evidence, but then having acceptance of them, or whether or not they have the rejection of different things and redo. So could you just explain any of those situations?
It's Jane here from Blind Citizens. I guess I'd like to respond to that around the difficulty of actually getting the application in the first instance. So what we've found is that the navigation of the initial forms that you have to complete to be quite difficult, and oftentimes it results in advocacy after the fact because it has been filled out incorrectly. And that's due to navigation with screen reading equipment, particularly around the complex amount of information that's required and additional documentation that needs to go behind that. We also know that, talking about the trauma-informed approach that a few of us have mentioned throughout the session today, that, having to go through that extensive process of getting verification of your disability, especially where it is permanent, is, adds additional layers of trauma to something that you've already experienced with your disability. So I think that if that can be mitigated in some ways without having to, go to that extensive level of documentation that's required, that certainly would be beneficial.
And anyone else want to add a comment?
Yes, Serena from the Physical Disability Council. Anecdotally, we also see, as others have mentioned, that the complexity of getting applications through and the time that it's taking is leading to people becoming far less able to support themselves, losing homes because they can't pay their rent in the interim, dealing with the issues of that huge time factor is causing more problems and putting people in a far more difficult situation whilst they try and progress their applications.
I've just got one final question, Chair. Miss Bingham from the Spinal Cord. I think in your application, and I know the Chair touched on your comments around Centrelink support and assistance and so on in the earlier stages, but one thing I did note in your submission was a comment regarding a single point of contact for applicants. Could you just elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Of course. Again, it goes back to our discussions surrounding the trauma-informed approach. For a lot of people, particularly those with acquired disabilities or traumatic injuries, this is the first time they may be navigating and interacting with Centrelink. And so the process of explaining their story repeatedly to a new person every single time after waiting periods on the phone of hours is a highly traumatizing experience. So I think it's really important to have a single point of contact at Centrelink and who assists that person navigate the entirety of their journey. That's from the initial contact for information about the DSP to the process, referrals to social workers, outside referrals to advocacy services, legal aid, however it goes along that entire journey. And I think, as Ms. Ovens mentioned, this is a very lengthy journey. I was speaking to one individual advocate this morning who is currently assisting a client going through a review, and they haven't received word for 16 weeks. So having a single point of contact is so, so crucial, because providing those updates is so important to ensure that people even just have the security of knowledge that, yes, my case is being dealt with, and, oh, I have a familiar face or a familiar voice on the phone that I can contact and name. Familiarity is so crucial. The process, we know, is so traumatizing for so many applicants, and we need to ensure that Centrelink really appreciates that.
Thank you. And on that, I'll leave it, Chair. Thank you very much.
Yeah, actually, I just one final follow-up in terms of that experience with Centrelink. And I think in your submission, you said that Services Australia staff often fail to inform people that they've got the right to contact a social worker. Could you just expand on any evidence you've got about the adequacy of the social work services that are provided by Centrelink?
Of course. I might pass on to Dee, my colleague, for this, because this is something that she's encountered many times with her client.
Thank you, Megan. Yeah, absolutely. So I've had multiple issues where a client's been told, we go into Centrelink, we go to all that effort and all that cost incurred for them to travel to Centrelink, only to be told, no social worker, they'll give you a call. And they have the right to be able to speak to a social worker. As an advocate, I make sure I'm empowering them with that. And then I hear back from the client in tears a few hours later because they've received a phone call, but it's not from a social worker. It's just from a regular Centrelink person who just says, oh, no, you don't get to speak to a social worker. I can answer your question. Just fill out the form. And that's not adequate.
Absolutely. Look, thank you for that. We're about to talk to Services Australia, so I might raise that issue with them. So look, thank you very much, all of you today, for your very extensive and informative submissions and for your evidence and for your time appearing before us today. It's all been really valuable and very useful evidence for the committee. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm now welcoming representatives from the Department of Social Services and Services Australia. So thank you for appearing before the committee today again. So I remind witnesses that the Senate has resolved that an officer of the Department of the Commonwealth or of a state shall not be asked to give opinions on matters of policy and shall be given reasonable opportunity to refer officers asked of the officer to superior officers or to a minister. This resolution prohibits only questions asking for opinions on matters of policy and does not preclude questions asking for explanations of policies or factual questions about when and how policies were adopted. So to start us off, can I please ask that you all state your name and the capacity in which you appear for the benefit of the Hansard transcript. Are we all there?
Senator, I might start from the Services Australia side just as technology catches up. So Brendan Moon, General Manager, Working Age Programs, Services Australia.
And Catherine Stevenson, National Manager, Disability Support, Pension and Parenting Payments.
Might need to redial in. Wait, that might work. It's gone.
Thanks, Mr. Moon and Ms. Stevenson. So, do we have the department being able to hear us now?
Chair, it's Matt Flavel here. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh, great. Good. Sorry about that. The wonders of technology will never cease. So Matt Flavel, Deputy Secretary, Social Security. And just before I allow my colleagues to introduce themselves, I'll just note, in the interest of saving time, we don't have an opening statement today.
Great,
so,
thank you.
My colleagues.
Troy Sloan, Group Manager, Pensions, Housing and Homelessness.
Taria Sastamoinen, Acting Group Manager, Disability, Employment and Carers.
Good afternoon, Chair. Andrew Seaback, Branch Manager, Care and Disability Payments.
Thank you. Okay, and Services Australia then, did you have an opening statement?
No, Chair, we do not.
Okay. All right. Well, let's then kick off. And look, I may as well start with where I just finished off with our previous witnesses, the Spinal Cord Injury Association, and their experience of their clients with accessing social work through Centrelink offices. So could Services Australia, could you talk us through what the expected standards and services that people should be able to expect for applying for talking to a social worker?
So, Senator, I can go some way to talk this through and see how much detail I can give you today. Senator, we offer social work services to support customers in a number of settings. In some settings, that does include in the face-to-face channel, so in a Services Australia service centre. In other circumstances, it is based on a referral model and includes extensive use of telephony services. That provides a number of advantages in terms of being able to look at peaks and flows, peaks and troughs in terms of demand of when customers might require support. And it's supported by guidance to general service delivery staff or service delivery officers who have guidance on when a social work referral would be appropriate.
Okay, so can you expand on that? You said some circumstances and guidance on when it would be appropriate. So when is it considered appropriate, and when would it be refused?
So I don't know that refused is necessarily the right way of articulating it, Senator, although I acknowledge maybe the lived experience may indicate differently at times, and that's okay. So in general terms, it's where someone's in significant personal distress or at risk. For instance, if there are significant barriers, if someone's going through like a significant relationship breakup, family and domestic violence, or has particular vulnerabilities that a social worker might be able to assist connect with other services and support them with. But we can certainly come back on notice with much more detail for you about what the specific referral model looks like, and perhaps a couple of sort of work through examples of what a referral would look like in practice.
So if somebody, as you know, per the evidence that we just received, who had been told that, look, your circumstances mean that you should be able to have the support of a social worker, and that they go off to Centrelink and then are told that a social worker will bring them back, and then they get a call from a Centrelink officer to say, no, you don't need to speak to a social worker, you can speak to me. Would that sound like a normal type of occurrence to you, or an acceptable way of operating?
I don't think it sounds like a normal sort of thing to me personally, in my experience in the agency. I would probably reflect, Senator, though, that not everyone with a disability would necessarily require the support of a social worker. So it would all depend on the impairment that the disability has, how that affects someone's ability to engage in the process. But certainly if someone needs the support, my understanding is that service is there and that the referral model should connect someone up with the service. It may well be that in some instances there's a desire to engage with the social worker, but if it doesn't fit one of the referral criteria and there's no real demonstrated need for it, it may well be that in order to ensure access for customers who critically need it, that there is some triaging that goes on, but that can be drawn out a little bit more in terms of how the referral model operates and how it looks to balance availability with need.
Okay, look, if you could get back to us on notice then as to sort of what those criteria are, what that referral model is, and some statistics on frequency of how many people applying for the DSP, how many of those are supported by social workers. Would you have those statistics?
We can look into it, Senator. We can certainly provide social work statistics broadly. My understanding is we should be able to provide it by the DSP.
Okay, and if you could provide it broadly as well, sort of across the board for the other services that Services Australia provides, social work services.
Certainly, Senator.
Okay. Look, I want to go to the rejection rates, and as we've heard a lot of evidence in this inquiry about people being rejected for DSP claims, and we've got rejection rates for DSP claims which are currently, understand, over 50%. Could you tell us what the current rejection rate is?
Senator Rice, I'll get my colleague, Mr. Sloan, just to cover those statistics.
Yeah, so in 2021, Chair, there was 96, in round numbers, there was 96,000 claims, 39,000 grants and 57,000 rejections, which is a bit 40.6% grant rate. So by definition, 59.4% rejection rate.
Okay, so what's the department's policy position on what is an acceptable rate of rejection?
Chair, I don't think I wouldn't answer the question like that. Our position is that those people who are eligible should get on, and those who are not eligible should be rejected. So I don't think we have a target rate, Senator.
It's Senator, it's a demand-driven program.
Yeah.
Okay, but have you done any analysis about the high rates of rejection?
Senator, again, not sure I would use the word high rate of rejection.
Well, I reckon 57% sounds pretty high to me.
As I said, I think the way we look at it is if someone isn't eligible as set out under the legislation, then they will be rejected.
I mean, that's a huge, as we've heard, a huge amount of effort, often, over a long period of time for people to be putting their application in. I mean, what's the department's view on, why are so many people then going through the process if you then got such high numbers, over 50% chance of their claim being rejected? I mean, obviously, people don't just on a whim make an application for the DSP. As we've heard, most of them have been supported by their doctors, by their job service provider, by advocates to say you should be applying. Do you have a response? Do you think that that's an acceptable rate of rejection, given the effort and given what we've also heard is quite a traumatic process for many people actually having to go through that process of application?
Senator, I think we've talked about this before, and I think I'm on record saying I accept that people have different points of view about what should or shouldn't be to get onto the DSP. But at the end of the day, we have a legislative framework, and Services Australia administer that framework. And what I would say is the people who are applying and are being rejected under that framework aren't meeting the requirements.
Okay, I mean, your recent evaluation, the Health Outcomes International Evaluation of the Revised Disability Support Pension Assessment Process, which was released recently, or actually, there was one released recently. The data I've got here was released on the 27th of November last year. Actually, so just can you clarify for me in terms of evaluation? There was an evaluation that you recently released. Is that one?
Yeah, correct, Senator. It was I don't have the exact date, but it was September this year, correct?
Yes, okay. It found that all disabilities had higher rejection rates post-implementation of the 1st of July 2015 changes. For example, among people with cancer, rejection rates increased 60%, up from 47% before the reforms, while for those with musculoskeletal or immune system conditions, the proportion of denied claims soared above 80%. So again, do you have any response to that finding?
Well, Senator, I think the point around the changes that were looked at by that evaluation was designed to ensure that people who were getting onto the DSP were eligible. It was about making sure that the evidence required was there to get people, those that were coming on were eligible. And as I think the key finding of the report said, that it wasn't appropriate, the way it's being administered was appropriate.
Do you think there's more work then that needs to be done if you've got, people with musculoskeletal or immune system conditions with denied claims above 80%? Do you think that there's some work that needs to be done then to communicate, how difficult it is and, discouraging people from putting time and effort into making a claim?
Well, Senator, maybe I can just say, as has already been pointed out, the primary mechanism for determining eligibility is both the legislation itself and the impairment tables. The impairment tables are a legislative instrument. The impairment tables lay out in detail the criteria used, the points attached to those. Those are available to all medical professionals, anybody applying and anybody helping them. So I think there's a full information set that's actually available both to applicants and the people assisting them that actually allows them upfront to know what are the criteria that will actually be used in determining whether they meet the requisite number of points to be granted eligibility.
That might be your view. It's sadly not reflected in the evidence that we've received of sort of people, even then when they rejected, not actually knowing why they get rejected and how access to information about what information they need to provide is being very opaque in very many circumstances. But my question remains, given you may say that you think that the evidence is there, but then if you've got, over 50% of claims being rejected, again, I ask, surely that would mean to me that there should be better communication of the criteria to the advocates, to the support services, to the medical practitioners who are supporting people and encouraging people to be putting in claims. Are you looking at all at doing that given those high rates of rejection?
Well, maybe it's not about the rates of rejection, but obviously, and I think we've covered this in previous hearings, to the extent that communication with applicants can be improved, that's something that between ourselves and Services Australia we're always interested in. So that is something we'll always look at. I know that you're using the statistics around rejection rates, but you can also think about it in terms of what's actually happened to the rates of approval. In other words, those who've been granted DSP who've applied, and I think we covered this in our submission, which at that time had data up until April, and you can see that the rate of granting has actually increased from the high 20% up to a bit over 40% in the last few years. So there's been somewhat of a trend evident over the past few years about actually increasing rates of DSP being granted.
Okay, look, can we get some up-to-date data on the DSP claims for the last 10 years? I know that we've asked for various bits of data, but in particular, the number of claims received and the primary medical condition. The number or proportion approved and their primary medical condition, the number or proportion of the rejected and the primary medical condition, the reason for rejection, and again, a breakdown by the primary medical condition, the number of people that were granted DSP who scored 20 points across multiple tables and how many scored 20 points in one table.
Yeah, so, Senator, certainly the as Mr. Flavell was talking about, the sort of aggregate data, if you like, the high-level data around rejection, claims, rejections and granting is in our submission to the inquiry. The breakdown of rejections by, we can certainly show the top sort of, five or so categories why people got on. The rejection ones we would have to have a look at to see what we can extract from the Services Australia data warehouse. So I think we'll have to take the more detailed ones on notice, but certainly the high level ones we can give to you. And certainly, for example, I can tell you currently, for example, the stock of people on the DSP, 35.9% or a bit over 272,000 are due to psychological or psychiatric condition. And so we can list the top 5 or 6 on that currently if you want. But if we're talking about each year about what's been rejected and what's been granted, that will take a little bit of effort that would have to go away and take on notice.
You must have that data as to what the primary medical condition are. So, doing that cross-tabulation.
I don't want to overcommit, but certainly on the reason why the category people got on. But if people are rejected, there might be multiple conditions that they haven't got. So if you get on and you've got 20 points on for example, the psychological table, it's clear you've got on because of the 20 points. If you've got, say, 2 lots of 10, what have you been rejected for? I don't know. I don't want to commit to something that may not be recorded in the Services Australia data set, but we can look at it and see what we can get, because the rejection reason may not be as recorded as cleanly as the granting reason, if that makes sense.
Yes, but if you could see what you've got, because surely
Yes, we will. Yep.
that data must be there with the different conditions, the different tables that they are assessing points on. And then if you could also provide us some data on the number of current DSP recipients, say as of, whatever the most recent date, perhaps, 1st of July, beginning of this financial year, who's, in terms of who granted their claims. So by the original decision maker, and again, broken down by impairment type, by the authorised review officer, broken down by impairment type, by the AAT first level, broken down by impairment type, and the AAT general division, broken down by impairment type.
I might indulge Mr. Moon and see if that's quite detailed, but Services Australia might have a view as to how difficult or otherwise it is to produce that breakdown.
Thank you, Mr. Flavel. I think Mr. Sloan's earlier advice is right on this. We'll have to go away and have a look collectively across both agencies' data sets just to figure out what's actually achievable. I don't have that level of visibility in the data structures. Senator, I think you are largely right that the information resides within a system, but whether it's empirical data that can be inquired on in the way that we're talking about, or if it's more qualitative data, is probably the point that Mr. Sloan and I are getting to understand whether that can be sort of brought together and put in the right kind of tables. So very happy for us to go away with our data teams and see what's possible, and certainly we'll pull together whatever we can.
Okay, thank you. And the other data that I want was on timeframes. So timeframes being experienced for a person's claim to be decided, and comparative data over the past 5 years. Again, if there's any categories that that timeframe data might be collected, broken down into.
Yes, so Senator, it might be useful if we take the broad question on notice and seek to see if there's any additional contextual information that we can append to just a basic timeliness table. I'm not really sure off the top of my head what might be able to come together to help give you a better view. One of the things that perhaps, and again, I'm not sure with the DSP specifically, but certainly when we look at things like the job seeker payment, for instance, it may well be in that context, if we were to provide you that table, that we could say the proportion of cases where we were waiting on information from a customer or there are other interventions during the process. I'm not sure whether those same data points are within the DSP data set, but we can certainly take on notice the time taken or the timeliness against DSP over the years that you've mentioned. The only thing just to flag is that I do remind the committee that the key performance measure for the DSP did change from this year. So I don't think that will necessarily change the fabric of what the data will look like. But in terms of attainment of key performance measures, there will be a difference between this financial year but previous.
Yes, but the data should be there. So that's right.
Indeed.
Even if you're analysing it differently for your KPIs now than you used to be.
Yes, Senator.
We had some evidence presented to us today of this disturbing risk of people who are on the DSP or with disability and on Newstart and their risk of homelessness. So do you collect any data on the number of DSP recipients experiencing homelessness?
Senator, homelessness is a flag within our system. Yeah, so
Okay.
Senator, we do capture a homelessness flag within our system if someone's disclosed it in a particular episode where we may see that someone's vulnerable. So certainly we could take on notice the proportion of DSP or the number of DSP recipients who have a homelessness indicator recorded.
Yes, that would be good. Thank you. Would you also have homelessness as a flag for people putting in applications?
Not necessarily, Senator. And sorry, just to clarify, I think I probably answered that last bit wrong. I took you to a stage that you weren't asking. You're asking around the job seeker people with who are on job seeker DSP provisional. So that absolutely we can do. Not necessarily, Senator. It would depend. We can certainly look if we do have it. It would probably be something more like the people who. It's hard to say, and it goes back to sort of to what Mr. Sloan was saying. We're more than likely to have more information about someone who's been granted on a payment than who has been rejected. So certainly we can look at what can be done, but it would be heavily skewed. I would expect to see that there would be more people who are current on payment or had been current on payment would have one of these flags recorded against them because we have more interaction with those customers on an ongoing basis.
Yes. Yeah. And so how, I mean, you say it's a flag. I mean, if they're getting DSP, I mean, how often are you contacting them or is that something that you ask them to inform you if they've become homeless? How does that work?
Typically, Senator, it would be that they would come to us for help if they have a significant change in their personal circumstances and experience a crisis life event. This would be an instance where certainly a social work referral would occur. So if someone's at risk or is experiencing homelessness, it's more than likely that they would be referred to a social worker to help a number of things, both look after, to support the person as best as we can, but also provide referrals to other support services, whether they be housing providers or welfare organisations or others. But that would certainly be more than likely where we would pick up that someone is homeless or is experiencing the risk of homelessness, and it would more than likely be a social worker that would record that flag.
Right, but so are you saying it would be largely through a self-referral of them notifying you to say, you know, they're in dire straits? You wouldn't, you don't have an automated checking in on people and sort of asking them questions that would reveal that?
It would depend, Senator. If someone is earning employment income, we transact with them every fortnight, and that would be a period where we would be touching base with people. There are other instances, I think we had talked in previous hearings around reviews. So if they get picked up in a periodic review, but equally there are relationships on the ground, really organic relationships between our service officers and local networks. So for instance, our multicultural liaison officers or our Indigenous service officers. As an example, we have specialist roles where they would be more connected in. So it could be that that the local multicultural group may, or community group may say, talk to Services Australia, a nominee may say it, but more often than not, it is based on a disclosure model, yes, Senator.
All right, look, if you could get us what statistics you have, say, for the last 5 years, that would be of value to the inquiry. And similarly, what statistics do you have on the number of DSP recipients who are receiving rent assistance?
So, Senator, I think I'll give you the number, then I think I've got to explain a bit of context of how we do the data for CRA. So the number of disability support pensioners that we, at the 24th of September, receiving CRA was 269,322. But there is, as I said, an important caveat to that information. So the way we work out CRA is by what's technically we call income unit. An income unit can either be a single as one income unit or a couple as one income unit. So, for example, you might have a household with a dwelling, with 3 single people, and so you'd have one dwelling with 3 income units, while you might have one dwelling with 2 people in it and they're a couple, and therefore they're called a one income unit. So in the disability support pension, where I've talked about those nearly 270,000 people receiving CRA, then there are 2 outcomes that are important to realise given the way we report that. So if you had 2 DSP people in a household receiving CRA, they'll be counted as one income unit. So therefore, and the second one is we have a hierarchy of payments if you're in a couple with 2 different payments. So for example, in the world where we had a disability support pensioner and an age pensioner in a couple that was receiving CRA, they'd be called one income unit. But in our hierarchy, age pensioner comes before DSP recipient. So therefore, that income unit would be placed into the age pension list of CRA income unit recipients, if that makes sense.
Okay. So it's difficult to then get a proportion because some people are not going to be counted.
Correct. Exactly right. Correct.
And Senator, I don't know if it's helpful, but just on the rent side of the world, in terms of broader servicing, the Department of the agency do administer the rent deduction scheme as well. Now, this isn't necessarily, or it isn't, additional financial payments for people who are renting. However, it does give customers the option of having their rent payments deducted from their income support payment automatically on their behalf. And as at 30th of June 2021, 319,072 customers were using that scheme. And also within the 2020-21 financial year, around about 9.13 million rent deductions were made using the scheme.
Okay, look, if you could take on notice, taking into account the difficulties of, having that one-to-one, get a proportion of how many DSP recipients are getting rent assistance. The statistics that you do have, it may be different categories as well. If you're in your example of having somebody with their rent assistance being attached to the person who's on the age pension, do you completely lose the fact that somebody then, their partner on the DSP is benefiting from that rent assistance?
Certainly from the point of view for the system to work out everything that the household will receive in benefits, we would need to know that there's an age pensioner and a DSP. The age pensioner would have to report their partner and any income, including income support that their partner would get. So certainly and I think we're coming back to Mr. Moon's point about in the system, it would record that. The question becomes when we go into the system, if it's collated in a way that's easy to pull it back out. So we can take it on notice, but I just want to put that caveat in so we're not over-promising. But yes, in theory, it would be sitting in the system. The question is whether we can pull it out.
Okay, if you could see what you could pull out for the last 5 years, that would be good. And have you got any data related to that on the amount that DSP recipients are spending on housing costs?
So I suppose on that again, we can have a look at what we've got in the system about what they're spending on rent, but to the point that if someone is a homeowner, certainly they have housing costs naturally, be it a mortgage, be it maintenance and etc. of the property. So in that world, we wouldn't have how much a DSP recipient is paying for their housing costs because CRA is related to rent. But for those who are renting, we would have the number in the system, but it's again of what we would be able to pull out in a meaningful way.
Okay, so you'd be able to have some statistic on the proportion of your recipients who are, I mean, basically, if they're renting, they're almost certainly going to be receiving rent assistance, given the cost of rent. That would be the case, wouldn't it? There'd be very, next to no people on DSP who are renting who wouldn't be receiving rent assistance, I would expect. Would you agree with that?
I can see your logic, but I want to take that on notice, Senator. I don't want to commit because it depends on the arrangements, obviously, because there is a minimum threshold and it depends on what the rental arrangements someone on DSP may have. So, yeah, I wouldn't want to go. I can see your logic, but I wouldn't want to answer that until I have the numbers.
I mean, because you might be able to then say, well, this given that this proportion of DSP recipients are receiving, are in private rental or in renting, then the proportion of the amount that they are paying on their cost.
Yes, we can definitely look at that and see what we can pull out.
Okay. Look, I want to move on to treating doctors' reports and medical evidence. So in the previous hearing, you told us that the treating doctor's report was abolished to avoid unconscious bias and focus the assessment on raw medical evidence. And it was suggested that the Services Australia assessors can pick up the phone at any time and talk to a person's treating doctor if needed. We've received evidence in this inquiry to suggest that doesn't happen. So I'm interested to know if you could tell me what the criteria are or what the circumstances are and when a treating doctor would be contacted.
Senator, this is a difficult one to explain articulately in the broad. It effectively comes down to the specific circumstances that a claimant has. So it may be that someone has a particular vulnerability. So if someone was a remote Indigenous client or indeed a remote client or customer who couldn't readily access, we might reach out once they come to us and say, well, I'm having trouble. We may reach out then. It could be clarifying a technical piece of information. It could be a raft of things. So it's kind of challenging in a sense to say specific circumstances where we would on the basis that it depends on the specific customer circumstance and the medical evidence in front of us as to when we would.
So is there a set established policy or procedure for making those decisions, or is it on a pretty ad hoc basis by the assessor?
I might take on notice, so I'm not across every single detail of the assessment procedure, so I don't want to mislead you. So I'll take on notice to what extent the procedures outline the processes for the assessors and give the guidance on when to make those decisions. I would probably just note, Senator, that these are highly specialised staff and they're skilled professionals. So there is a degree of judgment that's applied to this as well based on someone's experience and qualifications as to where it would be helpful or not to make contact with a treating doctor.
So we've certainly received evidence where, certainly the client thinks it would have been helpful to make contact with the treating doctor, that hasn't occurred. So yes, if you could let us know what the process is. And then is there data available about how often a treating doctor is contacted? Is that recorded, registered in the system?
This may fall into the same category. I apologise, Senator, about there would be things in the system, notes of call attempts and calls being made, but whether that's in a form that we could readily extract for you, we can certainly have a look into for you.
If somebody feels it would be useful for their treating doctor to be involved, what are the opportunities for them to advocate for that to be the case?
Senator, the DSP policy as it stands requires us to collect and evaluate raw medical evidence. So in many of the instances I think that we've heard of in the broad, but to a certain extent from some of the other evidence provided throughout the length of the inquiry, it may well be that the more effective conversation may well be with the treating doctor. So I think there's been some conversation around whether a treatment is practical or reasonable. That would be something that would be a conversation with the treating doctor, and then the evidence supplied to us could represent whether or not the treatment is reasonable or not, and so on. If you know what I mean, it would be in the instance where we would make the decision to have the conversation, it would be on the basis of the evidence. So it wouldn't necessarily be something that a claimant would advocate for, more something that the evidence would speak to.
Right, but clearly, I mean, we've had circumstances where treating doctors haven't been approached and they feel that the evidence hasn't been, appropriately considered for their client. So, I mean, are there different circumstances where if, Services Australia are arriving at a preliminary view that a claim is going to be rejected for treating doctors, to be approached and to be consulted?
I think that would fall into the category I described before, Senator. It would depend on the circumstance of the individual.
And so there's no place in the process for either the treating doctor or the client to say, I really think that you should be speaking to my treating doctor about this. Basically, it's a bit of a black box, and so maybe the assessor will speak to the treating doctor, and based on their judgment, but maybe they won't.
Yes, and so the structure of the way the assessments operate as it stands is that we collect the raw medical evidence from the claimant, which comes from the treating doctor, and then that raw medical evidence is assessed in line with the policy and the impairment tables to come to a conclusion. And where there are extenuating circumstances, we may reach out to the treating doctor, but that's not normal process. It's not normal practice.
No, okay. I mean, you've taken on notice to tell me whether you've got data as to what the proportion of times when treating doctors are consulted.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Okay. Well, moving on to the impairment tables, which you're going to review. When will the draft instrument be made available for public consultation?
Senator, I suppose what I'd say is that we have most probably finished. Well, we have finished our first round of consultations, including with medical practitioners and people such as in Services Australia, the medical experts that Mr. Moon was talking about, who use the impairment tables. We are very close to pulling together a brief to send to the Minister for her consideration, with an ideal sort of releasing a draft draft instrument with changes, showing the changes, hopefully this side of Christmas, but obviously there's processes we need to go through to that. But we are, as I said, I feel we are fairly close to having a draft instrument that hopefully at some time in the very near future we can share.
Can I take you back to what you just said, that you've had public consultation? Exactly who have you consulted?
I will grab that information for you. I have that. I just need to dig it out of my information that I have here. So we have a number of times. So we've had meetings on the 1st and the 13th of July with welfare and disability rights organisations, and so we had people who were invited, such as Anglicare, ACOS, Australian Federation of Disability Organisations, Baptist Care Australia, Blind Citizens Australia, Carers Australia, Children and Young People with Disability Australia. So a whole list. I can keep reading, or we can give that to you on notice if you wish.
If you could give it to us on notice, that would be good.
And then we had a couple of meetings with medical specialists that I talked about, which were things like the Australian New Zealand Society of Nephrology. Sorry if I said that wrong. Australian Medical Association, and again we can give you that list. And then we also had a meeting with the Administrative Appeals Tribunal, some of the members there who make the decisions, and sort of talk through with them. And then, as I said, we've had a range of smaller consultations with the people who use the impairment table, such as the government contracted doctors and so on.
Okay. And this review that you're undertaking it's described as a functional review. What does that mean, and what isn't it covering? What's out of scope for this review?
Sorry, what do you mean a functional review? Sorry.
I thought that's what it's been described as, that it was.
Well, certainly, I suppose that may have been used. I suppose it might mean that the tables are functional based broadly. So it talks about the amount, the ability of people, the function. They could look at how much function people have, what is the impairment. So from that point of view, the tables are functional, and the plan is to keep them as functional. So I suppose in that view, from that point of view, it might be considered it's a functional review. But I suppose what I'm saying is we had the large review back in 2010, 2011 that moved the tables from diagnostic to functional, and the plan is to continue to keep them on a functional basis.
Right, so you're not considering a broader rejigging of how they work. It's just
correct.
Essentially potentially changing the criteria in the tables.
I don't want to overpromise. It's more about sort of modernising the tables, and we've heard a range of views. But to me, the really start one is, I believe, on the for the hearing loss one, you need to use, I've forgotten what the name of it is, but one of those old telephones that that people who had hearing impairments would use. That would be one of the things you'd have to use with text and so forth. These days, the moving on of technology, people don't use those phones anymore. So there's those sorts of things where we can certainly remove some of those things that are no longer relevant in testing to test the impairment, as well as we certainly have heard broader things about are there ways to try and streamline, I suppose, some of the things around the impairment tables, like fully diagnosed, treated and stabilised and those sorts of things. So certainly I'm not saying we're doing anything on those. We're still in the process of working through that, but certainly we've heard that from a range of stakeholders.
Okay, and so is there anything that specifically, what is out of scope? You just said that what's out of scope is you're not considering going back to a diagnostic assessment tool, that you're going to keep it as a functional tool. Is there anything else that's specifically out of scope?
Well, I'd say anything anything that's not in the impairment table itself. So things like, I think we've talked about the POS, for example, that's not contained in the impairment table. So therefore, it would be outside of the scope. So that's again, but I think both the certainly the discussion paper that we put out talked about it, and I know we've said the same things. I think both to this committee and Senate estimates that certainly while we're consulting, we're quite happy to hear those broader concerns people have and the broader views people have, and we are certainly keeping a note of them, and they will be noted, for lack of a better set of words. And
I was about to ask, so how are they being dealt with if people are raising these issues that are outside the scope of this review? How are you addressing those?
So certainly the way I suppose I would see it is to the we'd always look at those things, and we would consider what we've heard from people. We would look at how we think it's being administered, how we think it's working, and then if we considered that there was an issue that needed to be addressed, we would brief the minister, and then obviously, as I think we've said explicitly in the discussion paper, that decision would be a future government process if we went down that path, because they are decisions of government.
Right. So in terms of what's about to be released, so the consultation on the impairment tables, are you going to also be identifying that these issues were raised, and they will be a decision, basically naming what those issues are and noting that they will be addressed through other processes?
Well, I wouldn't want to say addressed through other processes. They would be considered. They'll be considered.
All right.
Yeah. Look, to be honest, Senator, I haven't thought that through yet, but it's something that I'll certainly. I think it's your point's well made, and we'll consider what the process is about those other things at the time. If to what extent we will be releasing them, but I think a lot of things we have heard. It's not a lot of it's not new, Senator, is the way I would answer it, and you've flagged many of the issues in this inquiry.
Yes, you'll get a pretty thorough committee report that will have a lot of issues for you to consider. Is the requirement for 20 points in a single table being examined as part of the review?
I think that comes back to the POS issue, which we just talked about, Senator.
well, not necessarily. I mean, you could have different reasons as to why a POS would be implemented. So basically, your answer is no then.
Well, I'd go back to the original, my original comment was the POS sits outside of the impairment tables, and we're reviewing the impairment tables, or the instrument of the impairment tables. Sorry.
And all right, so basically, you're saying that in order to not the same structure will continue to apply. That if you don't get 20 points on a single table, that then you'd be on a program of support.
If you got 20 points across multiple tables, at least 20 points. Yes, Senator.
So that same structure to not be on a POS and to be then accepted on the DSP directly, the requirement for getting 20 points in a single table is going to stand.
Yeah, because maybe if I answer it this way, that the POS rules are contained within Section 94 of the Social Security Act, as well as the legislative instrument Social Security Requirements and Guidelines Active Participation for Disability Support Determination 2014, and neither of those are being reviewed. So by definition, if they're sitting outside of the impairment tables and sit within, for example, the Social Security Act, they're outside of this review.
Okay. Look, given this discussion, and there are these broader issues, it's been suggested by a number of submitters to this inquiry that the impairment tables basically should be extended as they are until a broader review or reform of the DSP process is undertaken. I mean, has this been considered?
I would say that the government has made it clear it's doing a review of the impairment tables, and they expire on 1 April, and we're working towards having an instrument in front of Parliament for that date.
Okay. Moving on to the issue of the complexity of the system as it currently stands, there's been a key theme in evidence to the inquiry that the claims process is incredibly complex, and it's in fact too complex for people with disability and chronic illness to navigate. It's a barrier to access, and in fact the complexity of the system worsens people's disabilities in many cases. So has consideration been given to simplifying the criteria and the process?
I mean, I'm not sure what you mean by simplify. Like this, I guess there's two aspects to what you're asking. One is a policy-related one, which is, do you make it simpler in broad terms for somebody legislatively? As we've already covered, that's a matter ultimately for government. It's a matter for the Parliament because it's the one that enacts the laws that support DSP. And then there's a stream of possible work related to Service Australia and the way that people interact with the system. I'm not sure if Mr. Moon's got anything to add just in terms of sort of consideration of simplifying processes.
But before...
Sorry. So, Senator, the only thing I would add to Mr. Flavel's comments is that Services Australia continues to look for opportunities to simplify all of our services, whether that be the DSP, the job seeker payment, age pension, or other payments. So I think I've previously provided some evidence to the inquiry and some things on notice around how we've changes that we've made to modernise the DSP process from both a claiming perspective and a staff practice perspective. The only thing I would probably add to that, Senator, is that will be a job across all of our payments that is never done. It's an iterative process that we will continue to run in line with the values of our master plan in terms of continuous improvement on service delivery to provide Australians with the services they need and get out of the way and let them get on there with their lives. The DSP is complicated policy, but I would probably just reflect on the evidence I provided on. I think it was the first hearing that we appeared in terms of we released the new online claim a couple of years ago. It did significantly cut down on both breadth and complexity of the claim, and we're looking to build on that as a strong foundation to provide a better user or customer experience as we go forward.
Okay. We've had a lot of evidence to this committee that because of the complexity and the process, the long process to have a successful claim, evidence that advocates and legal representatives are commonly needed in order to be able to successfully progress a claim. and essentially that these organisations are overwhelmed by the demand. So is the department aware of this issue, and how is it engaging with advocate and community legal services to improve accessibility?
I suppose I'd start by going back a step, Senator, and certainly we have that we run jointly with Services Australia, and I think the two chairs are actually on this phone conference, on this telecon as we speak, where we have a regular, I think it's 3 times a year, and my colleagues can correct me if I'm wrong, where we have, the disability advocates, we get them around a virtual table these days, obviously, to have conversations around, obviously information flowing from both the department and the agency about what's happening in this space, but also certainly, I think it's fair to say that the advocates do their job and they're not afraid to put forward their views to both the department and the agency, and we take them very seriously and we listen to them, and to the extent where there are issues raised that if we look at the issue raised and we see that there is something there that on the issue that they've raised and that it's within the remit of somewhere like Services Australia to change of practice, Services Australia look at that very seriously. And of course, if there's policy issues, again, as we've said earlier, we look at those and brief government as we need to.
So could you take on notice, given that you do have those regular round tables of sort of where issues regarding the complexity of the DSP claims process, where they've been raised, what those issues have been from those advocates over, the last 2 years, say?
2 years,
and
yep.
And what action has been taken on them?
Yep, we can look into that.
Can you tell me, is there any, what support or funding is available to the advocates or legal representation, that people can access to support the DSP process?
Senator, I guess there's a range of funding agreements in place with advocates around. We probably have to take on notice specifically what, say, the Department of Social Services does in funding, noting that funding can come from not just the Commonwealth but also states as well.
I'm interested in the funding that's provided to these, what we have heard, of vastly underfunded groups, but also funding for individuals to be able to access advocacy or legal representation. Is there any individual funding available for people?
We might need to take that on notice. As Mr. Seebeck said, the issue, I think you're asking, are there any specific to the DSP? Because obviously there's a range of advocacy services, both for groups and individuals in the broader disability space. I think we'll have to take on notice whether there's any specific that relate to DSP, or whether any of the grant agreements actually oblige the organisations to provide advocacy services solely for the DSP.
My last question, which again, if you could take on notice rather than 5 minutes left covering it, is feedback on the accessibility of government information on the DSP eligibility criteria and the claims process. And
sure,
whether,
we'll take that on notice.
Yeah. Another issue that's been raised by inquiry participants is the link between family and domestic violence and disability. And we've had a lot of evidence that the DSP claims process needs to be trauma informed. So I'm presuming this has been raised with the department prior. So what's been done to address this issue?
I think, Chair, and I might get Mr. Moon to talk to this, but I think we talked about the trauma training that Service Australia employees who interact with public. So Mr. Moon might be able to talk to that.
Yeah, certainly. Senator, I do recall we have 2 questions on notice that are, I think, due to be tabled shortly that outline the training that's undertaken by staff and whether that relates to permanent staff members and our contingent workforce, which is on its way, and also what the broader family and domestic violence strategy is in the approach. So my understanding is those questions on notice are imminent. They'll come back to you.
As you're responding to my question, I think I've asked something along these lines before. Yes, but I knew that I hadn't received any information. Look, a bit more data. And again, I think I might have asked it, and maybe it's another one on notice, about the number and nature of complaints that are received about the DSP.
Yes, Senator, I think that is something that we have on notice. Certainly, I believe we're coming back to you on customer satisfaction and how we measure that. And I think that encompasses both complaints and other feedback mechanisms.
Okay, thank you. And look, and just finally, one issue that's been raised, in reference to the people's concerns about people's disabilities needing to be fully treated, diagnosed, stabilised, whatever, that's not quite the right order, and the issue of where people have got a more temporary disability, and what consideration has been made to, if any, to more temporary income support payments for people with disability and illness who may be in and out of employment depending on their state of health?
Well, Senator, I think, as you know, because we've covered it at previous hearings, of estimates that would generally, some of those people would likely be on the job seeker payment with a partial capacity to work and with reduced or no mutual obligation requirements attached to that payment.
I think the issue is, as the evidence that was presented to us before, is that, we know that the job seeker allowance is incredibly low and people are absolutely languishing in poverty. People with an illness or a disability have got significant extra costs on top of their people's more usual costs. And so for them, they're already starting, way behind the eight ball and then having to sort of exist on job seeker. So, what consideration is being given to those extra, cost of living of people with disability or illnesses which are only temporary? Has that been something that that has been looked at as being a really critical issue?
Well, Senator, as you know, this has been a matter that the current government has looked at and made decisions to change the base rates of job seeker and other working age payments earlier in the year. One thing I would say is while there's not a one-for-one, while there's not a one-to-one between NDIS participants and DSP, it's certainly the case that a number of DSP recipients are also NDIS participants, and there's been a pretty substantial. Well, there's a pretty substantial amount of increased spending, as we see through the NDIS quarterly reports, in package costs that actually go to some of the issues you're raising about additional costs.
We've received the statistics, in fact, somebody quoted them today, of the proportion of people with a disability who are on the DSP who don't get, or on job seeker with only partial capacity to work, who are not able to access the NDIS. So there's a big cohort of people that don't get the benefits from the NDIS. But okay, look.
Senator, I don't know if it would be helpful. I meant to mention this to you last time that we had a conversation around this. I just want to make sure that you're aware that customers who are on the job seeker payment with partial work less than 30 hours a week
are on DSP. We also know that the broad...
Two of you talk at once.
Sorry, Senator.
Mr. Moon, if you continue.
Just clarifying that customers who are receiving job seeker payment with a partial capacity to work of less than 30 hours a week do get access to the pensioner concession card. So I think you may have heard from a witness earlier in the afternoon around the benefit that provides in terms of not just the discounted pharmaceuticals through the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme and the concessional Medicare safety net, but also broader discounts that are offered by state and territory governments and other organisations to address cost of living. So just to be very clear that when someone does have a partial capacity of work in less than 30 hours, they don't get the healthcare card. They do have access to the pensioner concession card that has greater financial supports attached to it from both government and non-government sources.
They've still often got, very significant costs in terms of other medical costs, transport costs, other aids that they need, which they are not covered off.
Senator Rice, sorry, I apologise. And I apologise, it was me conferring with my colleague, but just given we were talking about the overlap between working age payments and NDIS, just for the committee's benefit, I did want to come back with a statistic on that, which Mr. Seaback can give you now.
Senator, for people who are over 16 years of age and under age pension age, which is the same group that are eligible or potentially eligible for the disability support pension, over 70% of that group on the NDIS are also on the disability support pension. So there is quite a significant overlap between the two systems.
Yes, but that's not the statistic of the people who are on the DSP who are also on the NDIS.
There is a number of people on the disability support pension that we're aware of have not applied for the NDIS. So I think it's more a question of around encouraging people on DSP to apply for the NDIS.
Well, I think we've had statistics given to us, which I haven't got to hand. There's a relative minority of people who are on the DSP who are also on the NDIS. Thank you very much for your evidence this afternoon, and answering as many questions you could. Look forward to receiving the responses to the questions on notice that you've previously taken on. And for today's, if you could get them to us by the close of business on Tuesday, the 7th of December, that would be appreciated. So that concludes today's hearing. So on behalf of the committee, I'd like to thank all those who have made submissions to the inquiry and made representatives available today. Also very much like to thank Broadcasting, Hansard and the Secretariat staff for their assistance today. And the committee now stands adjourned.